Your mic's open, Misty.
Well, welcome. Could you guys hear that?
Yeah, I could hear it. I thought your mic was open by mistake.
No, I was trying to do that, so I wanted to open with that. So let me let
Oh,
it
I
fit.
couldn't really hear what it was.
Okay, then it's not working well. I wanted to open with excerpt of his "I Had a Dream" speech. So the I guess the sound quality was not that great. You couldn't hear.
It sounded garbly.
Okay,
That's why it sounded like your mic was open by mistake.
got it. Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Well, so much for that. I tried. But let me just begin by welcoming everyone back to Advocacy Arena's weekly live chat, where we gather to inform and inspire civic engagement each Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 p.m. Central Time. Today, of course, is special because it's also the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., born January 15th, 1929. And now it is a national holiday that was signed into law in 1983 by President Reagan, first observed 3 years later on January 20th, to be celebrated in 1986, to be celebrated on the third Monday in January, to be honored as a day of service. Today is January 15th, 2024, the third Monday in January, and coincidentally, Dr. King's actual birthday. How special is that? And we are staying committed to this act of service, of informing, inspiring, and uplifting civic engagement. I want to thank you for continuing to join us, participate, and amplify the initiative of Advocacy Arena each week. Today, we will continue our deep dive into Project 2025, covering aspects of Chapter 2. And of course, highlight Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the man, the movement, and the holiday. We'll cover some dark money stories and information and protests, current and then, and hopefully help you connect some more dots. To quote one of my favorite historians, John Meacham, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And as the axiom goes, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So again, I welcome you back this week with a small ask to please share and retweet the space, invite some friends, and if you do participate in the conversation, please tell us what Dr. Martin Luther King Day means to you. To me, it is a reminder that the struggle continues and that the freedoms I enjoy today are because of the sacrifices of many of our ancestors upon whose shoulders we stand, like Dr. Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and so many others. And that the moral arc of the universe that he spoke about is long. And we have to continue to do our work to ensure that it bends towards justice. So I want to pause to allow my fabulous co host to check in and say hello, and then we'll pick up with the conversation and the things we intend to cover. And also a reminder, we definitely will be keeping it brief today. I'm going to try to end after 3 hours because I'm sure some of you have seen that Soul Sister and I will be co hosting another space this evening with Geechee covering the Iowa caucus and also um, continuing to celebrate MLK Day. So, with that, I will turn the mic over to my fabulous co host and allow her a few moments. So, Soul Sister, how are you, my dear?
Hi, how are you? Happy MLK Day. Um, I right before the space, I saw this fabulous tweet from MVP Harris. Today, she said that she was reminded of the words of Dr. King's partner in the struggle, the great Coretta Scott King, who said, "Freedom is never really won. You earn it and you win it in every generation." So today, I ask the Dem voters that are apathetic or are considering sitting home in November 2024 rather than cast their ballot for the Biden Harris ticket, I ask that we remind each one of them of those words. Freedom and democracy will always remain under attack and will always be on the ballot. Each election is the most important election of our lifetime because it only takes one election cycle to turn the tide that keeps strongmen, fascism, and oppression at bay. Sitting out isn't an option. Living through the possibility of GOP presidency at this point isn't an option. It's not okay to sacrifice the freedoms and democracy of our own country to make a point or send a message. That's ridiculous. That sacrifice, quote, and I air quote that, endangers the very cause that these people claim to hold near and dear. But more importantly, it jeopardizes all the bloodshed, the hardship, the sacrifices our ancestors fought for, marched for, and died for us only to end up off worse than we were a year or a generation before. I cannot stress to you enough that this fabrication that they're selling, that somehow what they're doing is going to make us into a stronger country by sacrificing our own selves, is a blatant lie. And I don't know how we convince them other than continuing to show them facts and give them good information. And that's one thing I love about this space because that is our goal. That is Miss D's dedication. It is her life's work. And we're going to continue being advocates for democracy.
Well, thank you so much. I really, really do appreciate you and some beautiful words that you shared there with us. I'm going to dive in because what I found, I continue to do research for the space, always trying to be prepared because, again, like I said, part of my goal is to inform and to inspire, and to do that from a fact-based premise and not just opinions. So it does require me to do some research, and I don't mind it. I love it, actually. And so one of the things, and with MLK Day, it's always a great time to um, reflect, to go back, look at, and listen to his speeches, which is when I was trying to play for you there earlier. And of course, you know, most people are familiar with the I Have a Dream, and also the mountaintop speech, which really particularly, you know, speaks to me because it is, you know, the last speech that he gave before he was assassinated here in my state in Memphis, Tennessee. And just in my research of things that I wanted to share and highlight, and because we have been sharing Project 2025 and diving deep into that, I realized, and like, I'm sure I've read it before, but it just kind of went over my head, that during those early days of the movement, they had Project C, yes. And the C stood for confrontation. You know, Dr. King's presence in Birmingham was not welcomed by all, even some in the Black community. Local attorneys complained, and they wrote about it in the Times, that the new city administration didn't have enough time to, confer with the groups invested in changing the city's segregation policies. There was a Black hotel owner, A.G. Gaston, who agreed, and then there was a white Jesuit priest insisting in desegregation negotiations, and he thought that demonstrations were poorly timed and misdirected. But, the protest organizers knew that they could meet with violence from the Birmingham Police Department, and chose a confrontational approach to get the attention of the federal government. Um, Wyatt Walker was one of the SCLC founders, the Southern Conference Leadership, and the executive director from 1960 to 1964. He planned the tactics of the direct action protest, specifically targeting Bull Connor's tendency to react to demonstrations with violence. And this is a quote from him. He said, "My theory was that if we mounted a strong, nonviolent movement, the opposition would surely do something to attract the media, and in turn induce national sympathy and attention to the everyday segregated circumstance of a person living in the Deep South." And he headed the planning of what he called Project C, which stood for confrontations. And organizers believed their phones were tapped. So, to prevent their plans from being leaked and perhaps influencing the mayoral election, they used a lot of code words for the demonstrations. And the plan called for direct, non-violent action to attract media attention to the biggest and baddest city of the South. So, with that, I know that we had a few people requesting, but it's a few things that I wanted to kind of cover before I got into um, taking requests and having other people contribute. I wanted to, in my going back, listening to some of his speeches, I just was particularly drawn again to the his mountaintop speech, and I just kind of I listened to it, and then I took some excerpts out from it because I think it really can speak to our current moment in time here. And again, these are just excerpts because it's a very long speech. As he said, Baptist preachers can be very long-winded. So he says, "The world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. Confusion all around. I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. Something is happening in our world. Is that not what's going on now? The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, the cry is always the same. We want to be free." That is where we are today. Now, this is what he was saying then, but we're here again today. And he also said, in the human rights revolution, if something isn't done and in a hurry to bring the colored peoples of the world out of their long years of poverty, their long years of hurt and neglect, the whole world is doomed. He says, "Now I'm happy that God has allowed me to live in this period to see what is unfolding. And I'm happy that he allowed me to be in Memphis." What is that saying about, like, may you live in interesting times? I think all of us can say that we are living in some very interesting and scary times. And he goes on to say that that all this whole thing is about, we aren't engaged in any negative protest and any negative arguments with anybody. We're saying that we are determined to be men. We are determined to be people. We're saying that we are God's children and that we don't have to live like we are being forced to live. Now, what does all that mean in this great period of history? It means that we've got to stay together. We've got to stay together and maintain unity. You know, whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt, he had a favorite formula for doing it. What was that? He kept the slaves fighting amongst themselves. Whenever the slaves got together, something happened in Pharaoh's court, and he could not hold the slaves in slavery. When slaves got together, that's the beginning of getting out of slavery. Now let us maintain unity. Then he said, secondly, that he admonished them to keep the issues the main thing. The issue is injustice. And he said, sure, there's always the problem with a little violence. But even back then, he said, you know what happened the other day? And the press dealt only with the window breaking. I read the articles. They very seldom got around to mentioning the fact that 1,300 sanitation workers were on strike and that Memphis is not being fair to them. They didn't get around to that. And then he just concluded by saying, like I said, these are just excerpts that as that we have got to give ourselves to this struggle until the end. Nothing would be more tragic than to stop at this point. We've got to see it through, and we have our march. You need to be there. Be concerned about your brother. You may not be on strike, but either we go up together or we go down together. And I just felt like those words were so poignant, even still today. And that's why I continue to stress building coalitions and the fact that we are stronger together. And I know we have quite a few people in the space. So at this point, if you want to come up and join in the conversation, I will, bring you up to speaker. I see Mark down. I am hoping that we get a chance to hear from him because I know that he's very passionate about the issues in our Constitution that we're still struggling with, and he speaks to it with such passion. He often talks about how Mahalia was the one who told him tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream, and I love it when he says that. So, Mark, if you're not busy, I hope you're going to be able to come and join us today. But again, as I was doing my research, I was drawn, again, like I said, to some of the ugly images that I saw over the weekend, and I tried to kind of do a lot of compartmentalizing with the protests because this nation is not new to protest, but as our friend LMZ reminds us that it says peaceably to protest. And then, I'm going to be diving into a little bit of chapter 2 and highlighting some of the takeaways from that. And I think about the fact that, those protesters that were out there over the weekend were, orchestrated and funded by dark money donors. Okay. They're not grassroots. These protests that were going on during the movement, they truly were grassroots. And so with that, I am going to go to a couple of speakers that we have up. First, Joseph, and then Mark.
Hello, Ms. D. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for being here and joining in the conversation today.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for having me as usual. Thank you for hosting this wonderful space. Hello, Soul Sister. Hope you're having a good day as well. Um, so I was thinking as you're talking about Dr. King, and I every year on his birthday, I think about a visit that I took to Atlanta in 2008. One of my best friends used to live there, and he lived right by where Dr. King's resting place is. So on this particular visit, I went to pay a visit to Dr. King's memorial and pay my respects to him and Mrs. King. And while I was offering up prayers to them, I got very emotional, and I started crying. And the thought occurred to me is like there are rights that I have today because of Dr. King's work. My right, I have rights as a Latino, as a gay man because of Dr. King's work. And even just a little while ago, I remembered that back in 2020, uh, while Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still alive, there was a ruling that ruled in favor, basically, of LGBT protections under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Well, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would not have come about without Dr. King's hard work. I know he had been working with President Kennedy prior to his assassination, and then President Johnson. He worked in conjunction with President Johnson after he took office, and I believe uh, if and somebody can jump in if I'm wrong, but I believe Dr. King was present at the White House the day that President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
He was,
Okay.
and he presented him with the pen,
Okay.
the second pen. Hmm.
Okay, yeah, okay, thank you for reminding me of that. I wasn't sure if it was for that one or for the Voting Rights Act. But also the Voting Rights Act in 1965, that also came about because of Dr. King's work. And again, rights as I have as a Latino under the Voting Rights Act are because of Dr. King and his work. So um this is definitely a day to not only celebrate Dr. King's legacy, but I think rededicate ourselves. And I know everybody that is in this room right now is dedicated to continuing Dr. King's work and striving to make that more perfect union that we talk about. And this is probably going to be one of the most crucial years of our nation's history. And at the end of this year, are we still going to have that nation that we cherish and that we fight for? So I know I'm going to be very dedicated this year doing what I can. I know everybody else in this room will be as well. So that's all. I just wanted to say thank you for giving me the opportunity, Ms. D. I'll sit back for a while. I may have to drop out at some point because I have some things to do today. But thank you again to you and Soul Sister for this space. And I'll be listening in this evening on the other space that you'll be hosting. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Joseph, and I understand exactly what you are saying about how you were moved, because watching like so many of his speeches and documentaries about him, and just now in the space reading, I got emotional because, all the things that you said are true. And one of the things that I watched, because I've been there, but then to watch it on TV, I watch a docent give a tour of Dr. Martin Luther King's home and his community. And for the first time, it resonated with me how he and also the late great Representative John Lewis speak of the beloved community. And what struck me is that, like, he lived in the house that his grandparents had purchased. And this community was a very wealthy community for Blacks in the area, and it has been preserved. It's on the National Historic Register. But what was striking was he talked about how where Dr. King's home, his family home, is, it was like on that same street, there were many homes, and there were some of very wealthy people, and then also some of what they call row houses or shotgun houses. And he said, so there were both. There were the wealthy, and there were just the working class, regular people trying to survive, all thriving in the same community. So he says he believes that, that is the beloved community that he envisions, like the kind of community that he grew up in. And it was interesting because he said his home sat smack in the middle of like the divide from where, the big fancy mansions were above him, and below his house were the row shotgun houses and things, but all on the same street, and he was in the middle of it. So I just found this so interesting. So thank you for sharing that, Joseph. I really appreciate it. And so next we're going to go to Mark. And then we have a new speaker in our space, Daniel, who has come up, and we'll hear from him. And our see our friend Geechee down there at some point. I hope he comes up and shares with us too.
Well, hello, Advocacy Arena, Dee, Soul Sister. Hope
Hey
everybody's doing
there.
well on this observance of the King birthday and the holiday celebration that was fought for, not given. Um, and as you know, I love that you were reading some of the more unique words from not the most cliquish or circulated um, posts and what people seem to remember, or all people seem to remember about Dr. King and the content of character. Um, I know you heard me talk about this almost every Martin Luther King Day, but it does irk me that people actually remember the dream instead of the reality of the speech that he was given, because he stayed up all night to write the speech. If you hear some of the story, I think there's a couple documentaries about how he basically didn't go to sleep, and he wrote, I don't know how many drafts of the actual speech. And was just writing. He'd spend hours writing and then just tear it all up and start all over again. And he had no plan to deliver the "I Have a Dream" sermon, which he had given about 7 or 8 times prior to that. And it was a constellation of sermons, actually, the version he gave in Washington, that he had kind of just put together, and he ad libbed a little bit too, as he always does. But I think it important to, as you said, look at some of the other works where he discusses the different parts of his philosophy and how he looked at the world and his worldview of how he thinks things ought to be. Um, and the excerpt you just read was a good summary of his worldview and how we should fit into it. I posted under the space a post I made earlier, and I actually came across it because I had seen excerpts of this interview from 1967 from the pulpit at Ebenezer Baptist Church. I had never seen the whole 30-minute interview, so it's another good encapsulation of inside the mind of Dr. King. It's actually a really good interview, and I kind of miss these old interviews that ask really good questions, and the questions get really good answers. We don't get those anymore if you watch Meet the Press. Um, but I think how I segue into talking about rule of law and law is that um, the Dr. King's philosophy was buttressed in principle, and heavily anchored to the ideas of the Constitution and what our rights are and how we should be treated as individuals that are a part of this country, and how people should be treated as far as humanity in the world. It came from a very principled manner. And in that interview that I posted underneath here, he talks about why he selected and promoted and emphasized nonviolent protest as opposed to other kinds of protests. And he really, you could just hear how earnest he is, and it actually makes a lot of sense. And as people are protesting now, not necessarily violent, but some of the protests are, I would I don't disagree with the idea of protest. I question some of the motives of it, especially when one is getting paid to promote what it seems to be terrorist organization ideal. So, that's a whole nother discussion. But um, the reason why I mentioned that, and I'm gonna be brief so we can have as many people speak on Dr. King Day as possible. The reason why I mentioned that is because we are so immersed in the struggle to maintain just a modicum of the principle that Dr. King and those who fought with him and beside him and behind him fought for, just to attain equality in asserting these rights. And we see these institutions and these principles that were the mainstay of the civil rights movement. We see these under attack, and it's not for a it's not an accident that these principles and our institutions are under attack. And it's only those people that want to preserve this democracy that are fighting like hell for it. Some people want to change it, um, and I think that when I talk about, when you go to the Abraham Lincoln Memorial and you go to the right side and you see the second inaugural address, which was kind of unheralded because the country was in a mess and there was hardly anybody there. But even Dr. King talks about it in his speech on the March on Washington. If you actually listen to the speech, which most people do not, they just hear about the dream. And sometimes I just tell people, like, "Hey, man, it was just a dream. You got to get, you got to make it a reality." So that has a lot. There's a lot more. It was just a dream he had. I don't say it like that. I say it more sarcastically and meaning rhetorically, trying to incite argument about what that means. So as we get to these, pivot points in what's going to go down as a major time period for whether this country can preserve and continue its march towards a more perfect union through its preserved institutions and principles, which are not perfect, but it's what we got. We have civil trials that are going to be starting this week, where we have a former president that tried to buck these institutions and principles, and who, and in that piece that I posted too, it's interesting that it leads me to this. I thought about it when I wrote this too, when I wrote my notes down. Um, the Dr. King talks about, the grievance factor that white folks, or some folks, not just white folks, some folks feel about the advancement of Black people, and he gives a little historical context that
I know the I watched that one. Go ahead.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, about the idea, because of our um, forced labor into chattel slavery, we are looked at as things and we're dehumanized as people. And I just paraphrase this whole thing, but you got to, and I wish I could speak like Dr. King, but I just paraphrase it to get you to listen to it, because it's very, as you could hear in her voice, she was excited about it because it's so profound. Because not only was this, 60 years ago, well, 55 years ago, but it's poignant now that we're still seen as things, and coveted as somewhat or pseudo chattel instead of humanized as persons. So and then he goes into how, when people say you got to pick yourself up by your bootstraps, well, and then he gives a pretty historical comment there. I'll leave it hanging so that you can find it. But it's interesting that we come to this point now. um, so we have just for like a regular update, just to get everybody going. Like I said last week, it's everything's going to start moving pretty fast. There's the E. Jean Carroll trial coming up. The Supreme Court is expected to rule on, or excuse me, D.C. Circuit Court is expected to rule on Trump presidential immunity pretty quick. Should be this weekend, probably on Friday or early next week. Supreme Court, I am 75% sure, is going to reject cert on that. So the Chetkin trial might get going. There's a couple of bumps that are going to be happening that the opposition is trying to plan. Like I just read about the House trying to do another January 6th committee that's going to attempt to interfere with witnesses in the Jack Smith trial that we're going to have to look out for. I just texted a couple friends that Jack Smith's team is going to be doing some subpoena quashing motions in the near future because this cult is desperately trying to desperately and trying to hang on to this power that they had that America rejected with the most votes ever in presidential election history. And we're also waiting on Judge Engoron from New York to make his ruling as well on the disgorgement, where New York Attorney General Tish James is asking for 370 million and a lifetime ban for doing business in New York, and also the Supreme Court on the 14th Amendment third section issue with regard to whether Trump can even be on the ballot, which could be a bigger issue. I think they will do their best to keep it smaller and relegate it to at least, if not opposing, if not striking it down, which is going to be some flawed reasoning and striking it down, um, limiting it to a state by state basis. But I doubt they're going to do that. They're going to make something whole. So any any decision that the Supreme Court makes with regard to Trump being on the ballot, there's going to be a large section of America that's not going to like it. Also, as I close, it's important to remember that all the name calling that's happening, all the things that they're calling people, all the DEI and all the wokeism stuff that's happening, they didn't like Dr. King, and they didn't have all these names back then, but they called him a communist and they called him everything else but someone who was passionate about freedom, justice, and equality. And he was pretty consistent with regard to his belief system and how he was teaching it and how he was educating. And I do appreciate, after as I go back, obviously I wasn't alive to personally hear Dr. King, but my parents have stories from some limited participation they could have. They saw him at Cal, Berkeley, shortly before the assassination. I think it was 1967 as well. Um, and I think that we have that same dynamic happening here, and that dynamic hasn't changed. And it's important for us to start connecting these dots. So not only are we prepared, but also we can rebut those presumptions. And it's forever that because of our unique history in America as Black people, and the reason why there's even a 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment that provides freedom, justice, and equality for everybody in our country, even immigrants that come here, right? Birthright citizenship was specifically designed for us, but anybody who's immigrated here, we benefited off that. So as I close, it's important to remember he wasn't popular at all in 1968 when he was assassinated, and he was assassinated. He didn't leave. He didn't sacrifice his life. He was killed. It was a sacrifice, but he wasn't trying to be dead. And I know when we listened to bring me to that last speech he gave on April 4th, 1968, um, he even said it. He was meeting up with he knew it was coming because there was too many threats that were happening. It was, obviously he had the intel that, man, they're really trying to get me, but he didn't want to. He didn't choose to die. They killed him for what he believed and what we thrive and benefit off of now. And part of that is that principle, that belief that I'm here because of someone, and they may not have thought it back then, but they made this institution. They made it for freedom, justice, and equality for all people, and we are people, and that's the way it's going to be. And therefrom, here we go. So, with that, happy Martin Luther King Day. Enjoy your day of whether it's a day of service or a day of thought, or a day of just sitting on Advocacy Arena and listening to everybody and talking about things and even debating. This is a good day. It's a day to be happy. Don't let the detractors get us down. We're celebrating one of America's heroes, not just Black American hero. He is America's hero, and he did make them pay that check, even though it's not paid in full. they're making payments on them. We got to keep those payments going. All right. So let's go in 2024. We got hella work to do. We don't have no time to be messing around with some of these shuckers and jobbers and these, I call them grievous grifters. If you've seen my post, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We got to get out and vote. We got to recognize that there is a bunch of people that sacrificed and were killed for our ability to vote. And the other party and these other people, they are committed to not wanting us all to vote and making it difficult for us to vote. So that means we have a lot of work to do, and we can do it because we can do it. We're together, and I feel it when we talk every week. So thank you so much, Dee. Thank you, Soul Sister. Thank you, Advocacy Arena, for the Vaughn. Appreciate it. Can't wait to listen to everybody else, but let's go.
All right. Well, thank you. And you know that we always appreciate your insights and input. And when you were speaking, yes, that was one of the speeches that I listened to him where he describes being on an airplane and being confronted by someone, like, what's wrong with black people? Why can't they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps? And he gave him a really nice history rundown of why, the plight of Negroes at the time, they were called blacks, are so very different than any other people in this country, probably other than indigenous, but even still very different. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I'm also glad that you mentioned, and I think I had a tweet earlier that, I talked about how even though Reagan signed the the holiday into law, he also was someone who was not totally committed to it. Yes, I'm going to post this in the jumbotron in the nest, but it's an article that says Martin Luther King is not your mascot. But, it talks about, yes, Reagan signed it into law, but it's worth remembering that they were very contemptuous of him and consider him a huge threat during his lifetime. And he was incredibly unpopular amongst a lot of the mainstream. And that Reagan, even though he signed it in private letters, he assured his friends that he was really going to drive home through his presidency the story that Dr. King's dream of this colorblind nation had been realized. So now racism is over and we can move on. When did they do that again? Okay. When we got our first black president. Racism is over. We're done. We're finished. So, as I said before, this reminder that, history, the rhyming of history, it continues. This behavior continues. So, thank you again so much, Mark. I hope you don't go anywhere. I hope you can hang out with us for a
Well,
while.
just one little addendum,
Hmm.
real quick. Sorry, I just you made me think of it. That I meant to say it too. It's important to also understand not only historically, but as a legal footprint, that segregation was the overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court, which is the law of the land through Marbury versus Madison, rejected segregation. But the state, there was no ability to enforce it. So the Supreme Court had to come back with what's called Brown 2 in 1955 and provide enforcement mechanisms for the federal government to enforce integration or against segregation. And then it took the 64, 65, and 68 Civil Rights Act to give us equality. So it was a combination of legal efforts, but also legislative that spearheaded by Dr. King and his group and others around the country. And I cannot end without a book recommendation that I read it a long time ago, but it's one I always refer to sometimes because it has some good lead up to like where did Dr. King come from. It's called Parting the Waters by Taylor Branch. I talk about it pretty often. It's a great book if you want to just delve into the pre-civil rights world leading up to 1954 and kind of the start of where Dr. King came from, like even going back as far as his father, who was also a pastor. So that's a good book. I wanted to make that addendum before we move on. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that, and I appreciate it. And you make me think, Daniel, you're going to be next, and then Betty. But yes, because it also brings to mind that he spoke often of the white backlash, which, it's not a new phenomena for us, that always was persistent in every advancement that we ever had. And how, like in 1863, when Lincoln freed the slaves, but refused land being given to him, while land was being given to white immigrants in the West, and their families, and how in 1875, with the Civil Rights Bill, they refused to enforce them, which is why we had to have the civil rights movement of the 60s that he was a part of. And that was how we actually got to actually enjoy the civil rights that were, penned in 1875. And it was actually a weakened type of civil rights. But nonetheless, this is the white backlash that we are constantly dealing with in this country whenever there are any rights gained from any parts of our marginalized society. So with that, I'm going to go to Daniel and then Betty, and then I'm going to go back to my co-host because I want her to share a little bit with us about someone who was very constant in this struggle during the civil rights movement that she knows well, because that's part of the work that she has spent her life doing, and that's Bayard Rustin. And there is a great documentary which is going to now force me to subscribe to to Netflix. But so Daniel, Betty, Soul Sister, and I see Khalil has come up, and again, I hope you guys will share with me what it means to you in anything, in addition to anything else that you have come to share with us. So, Daniel, you're up next. Are you there? Yeah.
Yes, and Madam Host and Madam Co-host, it is good to be back in such a good space with such legendary people. And happy Martin Luther King Day to everyone. For those who do not know, I'll give a brief introduction before I go into remarks. I'm Daniel Grant King, and I'm a proud 26-year veteran educator going into my 27th year in education, and currently I chair the highest education committee in our state with the North Carolina Education Advocacy Committee, the first African American male to have entered into that office, and now going into my 8th year term in that role, and so it is a blessing to get to work alongside Martin Luther King advocates in my state in regarding the education realm, and now I'm running for office once again for the city of Raleigh and for the people of Raleigh in District D. And so, with that being said, everyone, it is good. I don't know about you, but today is a high day. It is a high day as we celebrate the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And as I've heard many great speakers come before me and talk about his life, today I was humbled and privileged to have gone to the prayer breakfast that we do every year, and to really speak with those who have been able to work alongside him, and for those who have really advocated and continue to advocate for civil rights, and for making sure that everyone is treated equally. But I don't know about you all today, but I as a Democrat and as an African American male, I am very proud that we have had Martin Luther King Jr. in our lives. And I know he was doing work before our time, but I want us to know, everybody, that heaven rejoices today because of his life and legacy. Not only he was for the civil rights movement, but he also sacrificed. He didn't ask to be dead, but he sure did sacrifice and made sure that racism and many other forms of hatred and bigotry was not tolerated. And furthermore, everybody, he also persevered in and through it all. And I don't know if each of you remember that letter from the Birmingham jail that he wrote. What a powerful letter. And he reminded and admonished us once again about how civil rights and many other avenues was very important. Oh God, somebody, I'm going to preach in just a moment. But he reminded and admonished us that we have a work still to do in regards to racism. We still have a work to do regarding democracy. We still have a work to do regarding civil rights. And I want you to know today that the work still and shall must continue, because as we know by now, and as many have stated already, that trials are being set against the former president of the United States in regarding to his insurrection activity on January 6th. But I want us to remember today, everybody, that we have overcome a lot as the African American community, as people of color. We overcome a lot. And so today, I want us to reflect and remember the legacy that he left us. Because without that legacy, without the work that he did in the civil rights movement, his work as a minister, his work in the NAACP, in the work that he did to make sure that all men were equal, without that work, where would our nation be today? But I want us to know that we're Trumplicans and the devil is angry. But I want us to know today, for those of us that are Christians in the room, that God is glorified, that the devil is horrified, and above all, we, his children, have been blessed and continue to be blessed. And so I want us to know today that without that I have a king, that I have a dream speech that he wrote and spoke before thousands upon thousands, without his work as a minister, without his work in the civil rights movement, without his work making sure that all men were treated equal, we would be having some dire, consequential things coming our way without his work and without others behind him making sure that everybody was treated fairly. So, Madam Host, Madam Co-host, today, on behalf of my campaign and on behalf of my committee, which I am chair, I want each of us to be reminded that his legacy doesn't end today. It should be remembered all throughout the year, all throughout 2024, as has been beautifully pointed out by the previous speaker before me. And I want us to know today, everybody, that there is a work to do. We know that Republicans are trying at every hand to make sure that democracy is going away. But I want you to know today that Dr. King has made it clear through many and advocated to legislatures at the local level, national level, and our state levels that we have to have these rights, and Republicans are trying to take it away. But I want you to know today, everybody, that it's not going to work, because he and many others advocated to presidents and many other Congress and senators that these provisions shall and must not go away. So I want us, as I close, to remember Dr. King's life, to remember him not only in every word, in every song, in every poem that we read, but in our actions and in our advocacy, because we know that this election in 24 is going to be the most important, consequential election in American history. We thought 2020 was something. We thought 2016 was something. We thought when Obama took office was something, but well, I want you to know today that yes, we had some great victories when Obama was in office. We had the first African American president ever in the history of our country. And so as I
Yes.
close, Madam Host and Madam Co-host, I want us to know today that Dr. King and his legacy shall and must live on. May God bless each of you today. Take care.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the sermon. I appreciate it. And these are all facts. The struggle continues. And with that, as I said, I'm going to go to Betty and then my co host to share. And then I'll come back to audience members on the stage. That would be Khalil and Geechee. So thank you guys again for being here today. And hope you continue to invite people, share and retweet the space so that we can continue making sure that people are informed and inspired by our celebration and our remembrance here today of this great man. So, Betty, then Soul Sister, and we'll go back to Khalil and Geechee.
Thank you, Dee. Tomorrow night, I think it's tomorrow night because I remember thinking, why not tonight? Dr. King's granddaughter is going to speak. And she was so articulate. She's going to carry on the torch. So I'm anxious to hear her tomorrow. And I took Spanish in high school, and I don't remember any of it because I didn't think I was ever going to Mexico. My Spanish teacher didn't set us straight that, well, they're here. I mean, they're coming here. I'm sure there were some here already. I mean, that was 1968, 7, somewhere in there. And Negro means black in Spanish. And when I was a child, black people were called colored. And I might be wrong, and I probably am. But I thought it was a better word than black because people are not.
Let's not go there, Betty.
Yeah,
Okay. I
okay.
appreciate your
Yeah,
opinion.
Yeah,
Let's not go
yeah,
there.
I
Okay.
okay.
yes, stop now.
I
Yeah.
thought after I started.
Stop
Yeah.
now, sweetie.
All right. Yeah. So,
But also, I wanted to mention the FCC. We still have the FCC. They talk like it was dismantled, but it only covers over the air broadcast networks. But when you watch the news on network TV, you have to see that Fox News and Newsmax, there's nothing like what they say on there. We hear more of the truth from the cable TV that MSNBC and CNN and like our
okay.
local Fox doesn't talk like Fox News.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to throw that in there while I
Well,
had more.
thank you for coming to speak. And since you invoked his granddaughter, what I want to say is that I watched her, and they have an initiative that I'm very excited about, which the NFL is joining and is going to be a part of. And I'm trying to find my note on it, but Reverend Sharkton had him on their show, and it was a call to action. Yes, it's called the Drum from the Drum Major Institute, Realizing the Dream Initiative, and it's just a call to action for people to get involved in service because they want. He On his 95th birthday, they want to be able to have 100 million hours of service to celebrate his legacy at that point. So yes, I always love to hear from her. So thank you for sharing. And up next, my co-host, then Khalil, Geechee, and I have a couple of other speakers that I brought up, and I'll go from there.
Thank you, Miss D. Hmm. Okay, what
Let it go.
I'm going to talk about Bayard Rustin. He is a figure that does not get enough credit, and yes, Miss D, you will have to get a subscription to see it, because it is worth it. Um, I don't know if they have a free trial, but maybe you can do that. Maybe you can do the 7-day trial or something. Um, Bayard Taylor Rustin was born in Westchester, Pennsylvania, March 17th, 1912. He was a Quaker. I did not know that about him until I looked it up today. And I don't know why I didn't, because I do know him. I do understand the history of him and his involvement with the movement. But I also know that throughout uh, the history of the civil rights movement, he has been one that has not been highlighted as much or given as much accolades. Um, Not so much hidden because he's recognized as being there, but not given his due. And what I want to point out is that, you know, he was involved with activism at a very young age. And he understood who he was. He understood what he believed in. There is a folklore tale that he organized an impromptu sit-in at a restaurant, local restaurant, where his teammates, his football teammates, were able to sit and eat, but he was not. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's been confirmed. But not just that. I do believe that part of the reason he has not been given his due is homophobia. He was a gay man, and he understood himself to be a gay man in high school at a younger age. So uh, part of how people felt about the gay community at that time, and still today, not as strongly, but back then it was a big deal. It was not seen as acceptable. It was, for him to be black and gay. Oh, that was a double strike against him. But early on in his years, he was very active with A. Philip Randolph and the Pullman. And he was very disappointed because there was a march that was planned originally by A. Philip Randolph. And it was canceled due to the fear that it would be met with violence. So I would say that he made it his life's work to continue to bring about an opportunity where Black people could come together in a show of numbers, a strength of numbers, to stand against what they saw as fascism, which was fascism, and racism and inequality. Uh, Not just that. And this was in 1941 when he was active in an organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I would say that it's like the earlier roots of SNCC and NAACP. So he remained active with them for quite some time. He was jailed for not meeting with the draft board because he was a Quaker. I thought he was just a conscientious objector, like he was just a pacifist. I didn't understand that he was a Quaker, and if you guys know anything about the Quaker religion, obviously they do not believe in violence. Nonviolence was, a pillar of their beliefs. So because of that, he was jailed for 26 months. But during his time of being jailed, he was still speaking out against racial segregation, and he did not hide his sexuality. He was very open about it, and so they placed him in a high security facility during his tenure with the jail system. Prior to the Freedom Rides, Baird, he decided to test the Supreme Court ruling of Morgan versus Virginia of 1946. This was in 1947. Um, the court ruling stated that any state forcing segregation on buses crossing state lines would be in violation of the Commerce Clause. And he ended up on a chain gang. But we see this as an example of the early freedom rides. So it was always in his plan and goal to continue to buck the system to bring about change and equality and justice. He eventually did end up, obviously, working very closely with Dr. King and what they called the Group of Six, the Big Six. I'm sorry. Let me be clear. Um, the Big Six consisted of SNCC, CORE, SCLC, the National Urban League, the NAACP, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So once he did become involved uh, with Dr. King and uh, begin to organize this march, it almost didn't happen again in 1960. And that is because of his sexuality. He had also had some additional run-ins with the law. He was already on a watch list because of his involvement with it during his college years with a Communist Party organization based at the college. But he eventually left them because they wanted him to start speaking out about racial segregation, and his sexuality also was a factor in that as well. So when we teach our young people about what it took, we have to remember that there was not just opposition on the other side, there was also opposition within our own community. And they did try to stop him from working with Dr. King, and even accused, even threatened to spread this lie and accuse Dr. King and Bayard Rustin of having a relationship of a gay relationship in a sexual nature. And so this is part of. I know we've all heard rumors. That this, Dr. King was this and he was that, and that is what it stems from. And that was in 1960, but obviously, the people did come together, and this march did end up happening, and it garnered about 300,000 people in attendance. I want us to not forget him. I want us to not uh, to not be unjust towards him, because it was a lot of his work. It was his blood, sweat, and tears that went into helping to bring all of these organizations together to build this coalition and to make this event happen, which eventually put enough pressure and attention on the state of Black America in America that gave us the Civil Rights Act. And I want us also to remember that despite what he faced, the opposition, and the Netflix that it's not a documentary. I'm sorry. The Netflix film does a good job of showing the tensions that were occurring at the time. I want us also to remember that at the end of the day, it was democracy and freedom, and that was the core of the fight. They didn't agree on everything. They didn't agree on everything about each other, even. They didn't necessarily like everything about each other. But what they did understand was that if they did not come together, if they did not put aside some of those biases and prejudices that they held within their own community, that they would never be able to make a difference outside of their community. So I did post a few articles in the Nest on Bayard Rustin, and I hope that when we speak about the march on Washington, that we do not forget him. And there's another man that we should also not forget. And I know I've spoken about it before in this space, and I'm going to speak about it again. Walter Reuther, the UAW president at the time. He supported Dr. King in such a strong way that many of UAW officers and international reps would often be carrying money belts if they were going to marches or other rallies or whatever have you, in support of civil rights and Dr. King, so that they could provide bail money for him and others who might be arrested at the time. And prior to the March on Washington, there was the March in Detroit. And the support that Dr. King was given by the UAW, and specifically Walter Reuther, is what made it possible for the March on Washington to occur. And although history does not often show the photos, but standing directly at his shoulder is Walter Reuther. The UAW has always been for civil rights. The UAW has always been about peaceful protest. There is a way to make your voice heard in this country and demonstrate and have a rally or have a march that is not disruptive, that is not violent, and still gets your message across. It saddens me. It really upsets me. It angers me. It frustrates me to see what is happening right now. I do not understand how these people really believe that what they are doing and how they are going about protesting is going to make a difference. And so, with that, I will stop. I will not lecture today, but I feel very strongly about where we are today. And it really just it just hit me so hard reading what Vice President Harris said. And I just really want us to take those words to heart. It gave me relevant. It was relevant. It was perfect because it's exactly what we need to be repeating today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate it. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to share some of the ancestors who were doing the work before Dr. King, who aided Dr. King. Because again, sometimes we have these figures, and always want to give Dr. King his due, but he was not in this fight alone. And he acknowledged that. And he, often gave credit to a lot of people. But over time, sometimes, his story is the one that keeps getting told. And I like what you shared and the way in which you shared it, because it again is just another example of how important it is for us to come together, and that, in retrospect, we can look at the civil rights movement and think, everything went smooth and everybody was getting along. And it was not always the case. And it is, kind of this case today. We don't all have to agree on everything. We don't all have to like each other, but we all need to love democracy enough and want our freedom and the freedom of our neighbors and our friends and our family enough to fight for these same things. So I just want to thank you for sharing that. And up next, we've got Khalil and then Geechee, and we'll, like I said, we'll go to like the top of the next hour, maybe discussing Dr. King and remembrance and the civil rights movement and these things. But I am going to touch on the Project 2025 and some of the other news issues, because what I like to do is to kind of lay some track and connect some dots. And I know we have some great speakers coming up who will give us more information to help connect those dots of the past to the present. So thank you so much, my dear. I love you. And so glad that I have the honor of you being my co-host. So with that, we will go
Love you
to
right back.
Khalil. We will go to Khalil and then to Geechee.
Happy MLK Day to you, um, Dee, as well as to Soul Sister, and to everyone in the gallery. I'm really happy to be here with you all and just to be listening. I've been actually jumping from space to space just to see how people are commemorating it. At least those who are talking about it. There's really been some interesting discussions going on from different perspectives. Some of which I perhaps agree with, some of which I perhaps don't. Um, but I've always enjoyed the idea of good, discussion, and I don't have to agree with everyone that I'm listening to or even talking to, because I just um, like to hear how people are thinking and what the priorities are of people who see themselves as part of um, the human experience. So I appreciate that on this day, Dee. You're asking what I think is a really good question, and you made me really, uh, whoops, really dig down deep to answer, because initially, at least, and I'm paraphrasing, you asked, what does this day mean to me? Um, and for me, this day made me reflective in terms of, I asked the question for some reason of myself is is what does how did I get here? How did I get to where I am? If I look at it superficially, I can just say, I went to school, went to college, I got, degrees, I, you know, uh, created a family, built a family, I, had a career, have a career, or that I'm getting ready to at least partly to end. And superficially, and I bought a home, several homes. I did all of these things just to look at it superficially. though that could be my answer. But to look at it in greater depth, I am who I am right now is an amalgamation of, uh, almost 70 years. And, from my infancy, from my birth, really, because I was born in a time when, you know, almost 50%, 50% of black babies didn't survive, so I actually survived. So from that moment to the moment now where I am, um, proudly uh, holding my granddaughter and making funny faces and about to conclude a career um, that stretches more than 50 years. And so so to dig deeper, for me, I am part, I grew up in an era when Dr. King was actually in his heyday. My years of development, my early years of my life was when Dr. King was coming into his prominence. In my household, as it was for a lot of black households, there were three pictures hanging on the wall prominently, and that was a picture of of John F. Kennedy, a picture of Jesus, who was white, in them days, and a picture of Martin Luther King. And uh, it was that's a significant thing to state because those pictures sent certain messages to us as children, to me as a young teen, what my family's alliances were, their belief systems. I know we didn't sit around in my younger years, talking about politics. Politics would be talked about at quote unquote the barbecue, the, quote, when at the family meals, the big holiday meals and things like that. And there was a kids table, and I grew up in an era when kids was just seen but not heard, as many of you probably grew up in a similar era. I mean, some of you, not many of you. So I ear hustled. I learned a lot by, standing around and being places that perhaps shouldn't have been, and learning from the adults around me. I've always been curious, so I'm sure that was part of the draw. And then I also grew up in an era when the civil rights movement was bearing fruit. The 64 Voting Rights Act, the attempt in 66, then 68, so the accommodations, and then of course in 72. So you had, I was, and I've said this many times before, I was the beneficiary of the struggle, of the planned struggle of our forebears. I'm the first generation that could vote unencumbered in this country, without worrying about how many pieces of candy was in a jar. I literally had grandparents who had to do that. So, um, and then I also grew up at a time during the Pan African movement when Black people were trying to establish the so-called Black Power movement as we were coming to our own, as we began to exercise and execute on these rights that always should have been ours, as Mark said earlier. And we're executing now. We're able to move out of the South. Well, the Great Migration had already been basically kind of was close to ending it by that time. The Great Migration goes from like late 1940s to 1970. So this was also something that I was experiencing. My parents snuck out of the South, literally stuck out of the South, and at night to get, frankly, to freedom as we knew it. I came north, initially to New York, and then my grandfather to Detroit to work for So sister worked for the auto for Christ at that time Ford, because Ford hired black people, and he hired black people at the same wages that he hired white people. Now, I'm not saying that black people got to work on the assembly line. I am saying that there was some quote unquote fairness to it, um, where my work ethic was established. My grandfather worked for um, he worked for Chrysler for 30 years and never missed a day of work. My aunt, my uncle, also established these really intense work ethics where they were almost never absent from work. And we didn't even realize, but it was a byproduct of our family legacy that all of us were like that, in, including myself. So, I'm a product of that, and then the 70s, of course, as we were exploring our experiences, um, you know, Nam was ending. Vietnam was a big part of our community, even though we don't talk about it. But Vietnam was a big part of our community because many brothers at the time ended up in Nam. It was getting run into the military as a way to try to find your way, to find work actually, but find your way into the middle class. At least that was the promise, and that was established even long before that. And we know that there's some really mixed results about that. But a lot of brothers died in Nam, and it was uh, those deaths were prominent in my community as I grew up. There were more than a few brothers that died in Nam, um, um, that I remember, in the sadness and stuff from behind that. And then also going off to college, as I was able to do. I've often talked about that in terms of how my community was so proud of me. They almost gave me a parade. They practically gave me a parade, as I, went off to school, uh, and all that. So, I mean, I'm an amalgamation of so much. Those are my foundation years. And then of course, as I become a young adult and go to college, and I learn more about who I am, about my history, about my people, about who I am even personally. I end up, you know, moving up and down the East Coast, meeting different people, getting out of my neighborhood, which frankly probably saved my life, um, um, and experiencing people with different cultures, seeing white people differently, to be quite frank, than I had grown to know them. Also, uh, so sister, I was a Quaker for 4 years in my life. My aunt was one of the few black Quakers in upstate New York. And the Quakers were one of the few places I could go where the family could go and not experience like the outward racism. They were accommodating. They were intelligent. They were devoted to pacifism. And they were not particularly secular. I mean, particularly segmented. I mean, they were there's different kinds of Quakers. And so there's even some Quakers who aren't even centered around religion, centered around God, I should say. They believe in the sense of community. And that was really important for me because right after that was just before I left to go to college. So I had this sense, a different sense of who I was and who I could be. Then I go to college and I become Muslim. So Quakerism actually laid the foundation for my 7 years as a Muslim, believe it or not. So, I mean, I'm all of these things. How do I get to this moment where I'm a father of two, an educated man, a husband, married almost 37 years, a grandfather, a man who has met everybody from Francis Welsing to Henry Clark to you know I didn't know Gil Scott Heron. I didn't know. I mean, these people were intellectually. well known, but you got to understand that black people weren't weren't were celebrated as they are today. So these people, in order to get an audience, coming to college or having these conferences was one of the few ways they could find audiences to talk to. And I was at the right place at the right time, again, in the 70s, where I was able to meet all these incredible minds, John Hope Franklin, historian, and, and so on. And I never really thought about it as I do now until really, honestly, um, I started teaching, in college and training staff. And I had these personal experiences that I could lend to my teaching. And I really didn't appreciate it until, honestly, I came to DU in Eugene's space, and I realized as I was listening to all of you that I came just to listen, but I actually had something that I could share, and you allowed me to. And Dr. Marshall, who I think is in the audience as well, uh, Denise Oliver Velez, these are somewhat my contemporaries. They're older than I am, um, um, more seasoned than I am. And so being able to have these voices, having to have this opportunity to share not just our experiences, but our intellectual insights, personal insights, and so on, has been really valuable to us. So, how did I get here? What does this day mean to me? It means that it's the time to be reflective. It means that I am reminded of that even though as I've aged, I still have work to do. I still have a part in all of this that I can play. I can't rip and run like I used to. I can't do the door to door like I used to. I don't have the stamina. I don't have the stamina to even teach like I used to. Um, but I do know that I have work I can do. There are things I can help with strategy. I can help with, meeting with folks. I can help by telling me stories to give references for how we got here. As Soul Sister was talking about Baynard Rustin. Baynard Rustin was brilliant, brilliant, truly a brilliant man. I remember hearing so much about him as a child. Bernard Rustin was like the Curtis Mayfield of the political community. Curtis Mayfield, as many of you know, was a great composer. All the great acts wanted to work with Curtis Mayfield. It's the same thing with this guy. People wanted his organizational skills, his strategy was incredibly important. A. Philip Randolph identified him personally as such. You know, Others have as well. So I'm so glad you brought him up, because again, he's another one of these people in our past that we don't know anything about. But because of people like you, because of you doing the research and so on, we're able to tell our story because they weren't going to tell our story. It's always been our job to tell our story. And if nothing's happened in the last 20 years that I appreciate most is fact that is that now we know that we can tell our story. We have the opportunity to, the venues to, the money even to tell our stories, and they
Absolutely.
couldn't do that before. So I am so thankful for this time. I know I'm kind of rambling here, but
Yeah,
you just made
I
me think.
love to, yes, and I love to hear your insights and your experiences, Khalil. But if you could just kind of, give us some final thoughts on it, because I got some few other speakers. And like I said, I do, we want to celebrate. Dr. King's legacy and what it means, but I also do want to cover some other issues in the second half of our space, so to speak, because I definitely am not going to be here all day today because we're doing another space tonight. So I appreciate you and love, all the experiences that rich experiences that I feel like we can learn from. So I am always honored that you come in to share those with us.
Thank you.
So was that it for me? I didn't mean to cut you off, but I do have a few other speakers, and like I said, I do want to transition at the top of the hour to
That's it.
some.
That's it.
All
All
right.
right.
Well, thank you so very much. Appreciate you. Love you much. And up next, we've got Geechee, then Rosie, and is Rosie still here? No, I think, and then Geechee, and then Shantae, and the Kathy. And Rosie, if you are still around and want to come back up, I'll just send out a request. So thank you guys again for being here.
Hola, hola, everybody. First, thank you for hosting these spaces. These spaces are so informational. They really ground us and give us hope for not only what's going to happen today, what's happened in the past, and what could happen in tomorrow if we all work together and work in unison to get these things done. I really want to start with just actually expanding on what Joseph did, but really expand on what Soul Sister did. 'Cause I think she did a really brilliant job, especially describing A. Philip Randolph, the history of labor in the civil rights movement. And I just want to talk about the other big six members, but also and talking about a very hidden figure like Bayard Rustin that I hope gets the same type of blow up that he did, because this person has been was really instrumental in us getting the legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 64, 65, 68, all of those things passed, plus all the legal challenges that led to desegregation, like Brown versus Topeka Board of Education was also part of the legal scholarship of her. So I want to make, excuse me, of him. So I really want to make sure I get this right. And I apologize for misgendering that person. So basically, when we commemorate this day, like I said, I want to give thanks and praise to lesser known and those that are hidden from public eye. But I really can't do that unless I expand more on who the big six were. And again, Soul Sister did a really brilliant job in doing this. Whitney Young represented the National Urban League and worked closely with Andrew Young, mapping out an inclusive economy that what was built from the urban centers out instead of rural communities in. And he understood that by doing this, it would move more blacks into urban centers where jobs are created, cities would become magnets for job creation, and would also be the source of the economy for American life. It would push those that could afford, to move out into the suburbs, which give more space, so on and so forth, but still also allow rural life to happen. Um, and in doing this, he basically presented a economic model that is the current Democratic Party belief on domestic economic growth. He also believed that legislation should elevate mayors instead of governors, an approach that's been picked up by Senator Warren. For example, Jackson, Mississippi would absolutely sign up for ACA and do Medicaid expansion. The governor of Mississippi, a white Christo fascist, Tate, would never sign up for that. But if we give the power and we start writing legislation that empowers cities and counties as opposed to mayors, we can get help to where 2/3 of blacks live at, which is in the South, where 2/3 of Latinos live at, which is in the Sun Belt, and where 2/3 of Asians live at, again, which is in the Sun Belt. So we have a lot of these people, of our own people, that live in red states, and this would empower them with the same type of benefits that we get in blue states. For example, we have the ACA here in New Jersey. We have Medicaid expansion here in New Jersey. But my sisters that live in South Carolina don't have that. They don't have it in Texas, and they don't have it in Florida. And by making this change, it would make that happen. Roy Wilkins represented the NAACP and was the member that brought monetary support and paid for legal actions, namely derived from a hidden transgender man. This person's name was Polly Murray, and her mentee, former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. And again, I'll talk about Polly Murray later because she's really important.
Love her. Yes.
A. Philip Randolph brought labor organization and was the godfather of using data plus public opinion to drive home their message for social justice. He is one of my mentors, not mentor in real life, but like mentors from what I've read. And it's geared me a lot in how I organize myself and how I, data is what I do in my work profession and how I understand that it can shape public opinion. And a good example of how he did that was the sit-ins, where they originally the NAACP chapter used Claudette Colvin, a pregnant teen, to be the person that they wanted to be the face of this. But A. Philip Randolph did polling, looked again, did focus groups, talked to people, talked to blacks, Latinos, but mainly whites because it was we had to change the mind of whites to get these things done. And Claudette Colvin was not going to work. So he used a woman named Rosa Parks. I don't know if y'all heard of her before, but Rosa Parks was the person that sat in on the bus, and that became a big media firestorm. And the sympathy and empathy that came towards her really helped in the movement. And I and most other people that are in data are indebted to him. I know he's also a big figure in the labor in the labor movement. I've learned a lot about labor. Thank God for her soul sister. That's not something I grew up or experienced a lot in the states that I lived in. James Farmer was the creator and first leader of CORE. CORE is a hot mess now, but CORE at the beginning was really about advancing the lives of Black people. He worked directly with protests organized by Bayard Rustin and his chief assistant, and that's Bayard Rustin's chief assistant, DC Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton. If you ever get the chance to meet this wonderful, brilliant, and kind woman, she can tell you so many stories about all these people. She's a living legend. I love her so much. But they organized everything from the Freedom Rides to the March on Washington. They organized successful, peaceful demonstrations when there were a part of the Big Six that thought that the peaceful route wasn't always the way to go. And that leads to we all know Dr. King, Summer 52, pledge of the Sigma chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Incorporated. We all know about Dr. King and his beautiful wife, Coretta, who was also instrumental in the civil rights movement. But it leads us to the last member of the Big Six. And I think it's important as we talk about protests now and protests in the past, that there wasn't always agreement on doing peaceful demonstrations. And that came from SNCC. And SNCC was led by John Lewis. And his two lieutenants were James Clyburn and Bernie Thompson. And if you remember, a lot of times when the squad gets a little bit obnoxious, which they do often, he's quick to chime in on the lessons that he learned about protests and about trying to legislate that actually set the movement back, and he doesn't want them to make the same mistakes. It seemed to work for like maybe a minute with Cori Bush, but then it went over her head. It seemed to have worked with other members that have not been setting themselves on fire as much. As I said, they were to the left of the other five members. They were willing to use confrontation and protest. They were driven more by the teachings of Malcolm X than the message by King, and they truly spoke to the beliefs of younger blacks at the time. They had to constantly be reeled in by A. Philip Randolph, who really was annoyed by what he called stunts and pranks that John Lewis and his group were doing. But A. Philip Randolph could never dream that the replacements for them would be even more to the left and more radical. Because shortly after this time, at the beginning of these legislation passed, Stokely Carmichael, Cleveland Sellers, that's the father of Bakari Sellers, and Gloria Richardson were voted in as John Lewis, James Clyburn, and Benny Thompson were voted out of SNCC. And their beliefs pushed Nick out of the Big Six and eventually ended the partnership of these six groups. Now to that hidden figure who deserves all of his flowers, and that is Polly Murray. Her dead name was Anna Polly Murray, but she was assigned female at birth. We would call her a lesbian back then, but nowadays we would refer to her as a transgender man. Um, he was an American civil rights activist, advocate, and the legal scholar behind the civil rights movement, a political religious theorist, author, and later in life became an Episcopalian priest. Murray's work influenced the civil rights movement and expanded protections for gender equality, immigrant rights, the rights based on skin color, and then later the model used by the LGBTQIA plus community after all of their defeats in 2008 was to use the groundwork built by Pauli Murray, which actually led to marriage equality and also gays, lesbians, transgendered, and others that are part of this queer movement included into the Civil Rights Act. She enrolled in law school at Howard University, becoming the first woman ever accepted, and she was the only woman in her class. She graduated first in her class, but she was denied the chance to do postgraduate work at Harvard University because they didn't allow women to do that. And she called such precedents against women, especially Black and Latino and Asian women, Jane Crow. And according to Jane Crow laws that enforce racial segregation in the southern United States, she was barred from a lot of academic activity and civil rights work, and her mentee had to be the face of it instead. And as a lawyer, Murray argued for civil rights and women's rights. The I'm stumbling today with my words. The NAACP's chief counsel, Thurgood Marshall, called Murray's 1950 books, States Laws on Race and Color, the Bible of the civil rights movement. He was a mentee of Murray who worked with her and the Senate to write the Civil Rights Acts of 64, 65, and 68. So, putting it bluntly, without Pauli Murray, none of the winning legal strategies and legislation that is made in this country would never happen. And these legislation has made this country a little bit more equal, a little bit more equitable, but of course, we have a long way to go. Again, I want to thank you for allowing me to speak today. Thank you for holding this space. I look forward to working with the two of y'all tonight on our spaces about the Iowa caucuses. And to everybody, happy MLK Day.
Awesome, Geechee. Thank you for giving us just a little bit more history. And I feel like this is just tuning this up for next month because so much great history to share. And I love like bringing these hidden figures out of the shadow and giving them their due. And you're great at doing that. And, you know, Soul Sister as well. And I love it. I can't wait to next month when we can be digging into more and more of this and these figures on whose shoulders we stand, who's have done the work that allow us to experience the freedoms that we have. And we are, you know, at the same time, new figures are being born and continuing to do the work because it's required by every generation. So again, thank you so very much. And if you can, would you put our space up in the nest in the jumbotron for us? And you know, I'll make sure
Yes, I
that
will.
I invite people later to it as well. So the next speaker we have up, I'm so happy that she's able to be with us today, and that is the Shantizi, Miss Shantae. So how are you today, my dear? And then the Kathy.
I'm fine. I'm fine. Happy Martin Luther King Day. Happy birthday to Martin Luther King. He would have been 95 years old this year. So happy birthday to him. It sometimes it's rare, like his day will actually fall on his birthday, which is ironic. So people need to recognize on the news, even though it's Martin Luther King Day, but I think people didn't recognize also today is his birthday. A Capricorn for some of those Capricorns. Happy birthday.
Yes, and there is someone in the community, Terry. Terry shares his birthday, and I saw that, and that is just so awesome. But thank you. I know, and I feel like it is so special that we get to honor, you know, the holiday, but actually on his actual birthday. So continue. Thank you.
Agreed. And it was great to hear, Gishi always he's like a human encyclopedia, just like a walking one, just like has so much data. He just gotta narrow it down at times. And
I don't
Mark
know what narrow means.
Lord. And Mark is great. And I didn't hear Joseph, but because I was still eating breakfast and still getting myself together. Because after this, I am going to finish cleaning my bathroom and I'm going to the gym for a little bit before those spaces tonight because I have some time, which is good. Even though it's really cold, but I wouldn't mind going to the gym. So hello to everyone in here. Uh I may be like the real, blunt one in here today, but somebody needs to, right? So, On this day, we honoring the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, what he stood for, all the people he worked with, including Bear Rustin, who did not get the recognition because then people just still like don't know who he is. I knew who he was. I learned about him. I knew about him when I was a kid, but I knew about him like in junior high and high school and college. Like you read more in depth, especially like high school and college. You read more in depth because there's also schools named after them. There's different parts of programs named after him, named after A. Philip Randolph. Things that are named after him that I know of, but other folks don't. Um, Also, uh, we're honoring him. We're honoring his wife, Coretta Scott King, who died nearly almost 20 years ago. Around this time, it'll be 18 years since she died, so it was close to 20 around this time. But I just want to bring to the attention. It's amazing how people use the quotes, and even though his youngest daughter, Bernice, who I actually respect a lot, and it's no shade to other people in his family, but the other extended members of their family are very interesting. We're not going to go there today, but that's a whole nother conversation. But kudos to Miss Bernice, who told people, don't quote my father if you're not about the business. If you're not about the work, don't do it. And of course, people caught them fucking selves doing it, including Nancy Ruth Mace, aka the Chick Monk. Um, let's see. Who else done it? Addison Mitchell McConnell, how dare thee? And it was a couple other people, Mike Lawler, and had a whole goddamn video about it, which I probably will do a video tonight because I wasn't going to do one tonight, but I think one needs to be done because it just needs to be done. And you have people woman splaining, Karen splaining on the View today, Alyssa, about people need to come together and everything when your father was a whole ass birther and still is a birther, and there's birther attacks on your candidate Nimrata Nikki Haley, but you don't speak to birtherism because you worked for a birther, which is your father. And so it's amazing to me how everyone is like, so, oh, Dr. King's work, and they take one quote of, not, don't judge the content, don't judge the person of color by the content of their character. I'm like, no, let's judge by their color, because if you didn't listen to the whole effing speech, he is judging by the color because it is white moderates like Dean Phillips, who was another one who did that shit. It's just very interesting to me. I'm surprised Nimrata didn't tweet anything yet because it's the Iowa caucus, but it'd be in time when her and Ronald DeSantis will tweet something, but they kind of know better in a way because they've been blasted for their comments, and that bum from Jamaica Estates is not going to tweet anything about what you call it. I'm a fine Timothy Eugene Scott. If he tweeted something, I'm gonna be like, remember when you danced around questions about race and America is not a racist country? I think we should play those clips. The internet lasts forever, and you doing all this quotes and everything, but you do the very opposite of what Dr. King stands for. It amazes me. It amazes me. Everybody's an expert on civil rights. Everybody's an expert on this. Everybody's an expert on that. My parents, who are, by the way, my mom is 70, my dad will be 70 this year. They were children during the civil rights movement, different regions of the country on the eastern borderline. My father was here up north. My mom was down south in the segregated South Carolina, to be exact. The same state where the Civil War started, and it was about slavery. But it was the civil rights movement around that time. And her town, Utahville, was heavily segregated. Her high school was segregated. My mom's school wasn't integrated to 1970. And my mom was in her last year of high school. My dad, he grew up here. It was not as crazy up here, but it was racism to its core. I mean, they had, what you call it, Rockefeller was their governor at the time, Nelson D. Rockefeller. Also, what else? They There was Northern Republicans that was just racist to their core. Also, the neighborhoods were segregated. There were certain neighborhoods that had certain things, and other neighborhoods did not have a lot of things. And so we have to think about where this country was 60, almost 70 years ago. Mostly 60 years ago. Because I think it's 60 years, it's coming upon 60 years that the Civil Rights Act, or is it 65, 1964, 1965 was passed. We're coming up on 60 years. So think about where this country was 60 something years ago. Think about it. I wasn't born yet. I was born in the 1980s. I had my sisters and I, we were born without civil rights. My parents wasn't. My parents were like 10, 11 ish when they got their civil rights. And it will be upon next year 65, 60 years. 60 years in 1965 will be 60 years that black people had the right to vote. So when people take that fucking quote, excuse my French, don't judge the person by their color but by the content of their character, they really need to think about what the fuck they're saying. Because you motherfuckers did not listen to any of the other speeches that Dr. King said. And I'm gonna try to find the one where he was at the church the year before he died, where he explained about the white moderates and white conservatives. Because obviously y'all getting shit all the way the fucked up. All everything fucked up. I had to put out a tweet today to remind people because I heard the Iowa caucuses today, and I understand there's the Iowa caucus, but it's Dr. Martin Luther King Day. They could have pushed that shit Tuesday, Wednesday. They didn't, and they didn't want to, but that's okay. It is fine because it tells me where Iowa is, and I'm glad the Democratic Party made that bold move where they said, let's start, our stuff in South Carolina first. Let's do that shit in South Carolina because Iowa, since I don't know, since like the 80s, have been going Republican. I mean, they voted their first one of their first Republican senators in Chuck Grassley, who's been in that seat since the 1980s. He's been in that seat for over 40 years. That man is 90 years old, about to be 91. About to be 91. And y'all talk about the president's age. The president's more sharp, move faster, works out. I mean, if I was 81 doing Pilates, I can't, no, I can't. But like I said, I don't want to derive to anything. But back to what I was saying, I find it interesting that the same dumbass Republicans elected in Congress or like talking heads quoting one quote about Dr. Martin Luther King, but their party's undoing everything else. And what I also find interesting today, if y'all don't see it in Miss Bernice's threat about her mom at the funeral of her dad, how they was like your father would not stand for, they said your father made money off of Zionists and took money off of Zionists, and I said and another tweet I'm gonna put in the jumbotron where your father would have protested against the war in Gaza in the church. First of all, he would not never held a protest in the fucking church. He would have had a sermon about it because the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I'm sorry, had decorum. He had decorum in the church. And he would not allow that cursing and that carrying on in that church last week like they did. So I'm saying to everybody, let's honor the work and let's be real about what he said instead of taking one fucking quote of what he said. And Dee, thank you so much because you always keep it real. Thank you, soul sister, for telling people about Bernard Artisan, even though I knew about it. But I'm glad you was able to explain. I'm glad the human encyclopedia, I don't know where he went. And I see Kathy over here was popping. Hello, Mark. And I see LMZ. I see all of you good people here. So thank you so much and enjoy your day.
Well, thank you, Shantae. I am glad that you had an opportunity to come in and share with us today, which is why I continue to hold this space even on holidays, because I know the time that I hold it, it's every week. A lot of people can't make it or they're tuning in at work. So on holidays, I know that it gives other people who aren't aren't able to always contribute, an opportunity to contribute to the conversation. And very good points that you brought up. And I did put in the nest the quote from Dr. Bernice King, which I loved. Like, she cautioned people yesterday, before you start speaking about my father, listen to these things. And it is up in the nest, and I've retweeted it a few times on my timeline, and I listen to them, and they're beautiful, because you need to understand what he was about and what the entire movement entailed. So again, just thank you for the reminder. And again, speaking, coming to share with us. So up next, we have the Kathy, who has joined us. And shortly after that, we're going to be transitioning to the, like I said, covering. We'll still, do some things about Dr. King because they're tied in, but I do want to cover some of the issues in the news, the protest, Project 2025 as well. So thanks again. The Kathy, you're up next.
Thank you, Dee, and thank you, everyone. And I just want to say happy birthday to Dr. King. I wanted to try to bring some economic clarity to who he was as well, because not only did he talk about I Have a Dream, his central advocacy was for economic power within our community. If you remember the economic boycott, or rather the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasts 381 days, by the way, that actually put a dent into the powers that be with the bus company. People were willing to walk. Think about this now. People were willing to walk or have their employers bring them to work and back, but they refused to ride the bus after that incident with Rosa Parks. Afterwards, Rosa Parks um, became a central figure within that Montgomery boycott. But I wanted to kind of take that and apply it to what we're seeing here today. I want to tell people, and I really want us to listen to this. In the year 2025, next year, according to Nielsen, our economic power, Black economic purchasing power, will reach close to $2 trillion. Let that marinate. $2 trillion. The budget deficit for the United States as of this year is 1.7 trillion. Our economic power is higher than the US deficit budget overall. You got to think about that now. We have this power, but we are not using it, and we are not utilizing it like Dr. King with the Montgomery boycott. If you think about what we contribute financially and economically to this country, all you need to do is to go back into our athletic department. The NCAA has, as of 2019, they grossed $15.8 billion off our student athletes. That's our Black athletes in basketball and mainly football. Of all of the money, the 15.8 billion, only 2.9 billion, 18.2%, was returned to athletes in the form of athletic scholarships, and only 1% spent on medical treatment and insurance protection. If you contrast that, 35% of that money was spent it was spent on administrative and coaching compensation. And that money also trickled down to those athletes, or rather those programs that did not generate the same revenues as football or men's basketball. Now you think about that. Think about that for a moment. You have a child that you're pushing up. Oh, I want my kid to go into the NCAA. I want my kid to play professional basketball. You know, think about it. He's not getting paid. He might get a scholarship, but he's not getting paid. They're getting paid revenue off of your child. They're getting paid by the gaming, the licensing of your child, the sports memorabilia, and also the gaming and the television ad revenue. This is why I call it the new slavery. We are giving away our economic power and are not benefiting about it with it. We have got to change our minds with doing this. Another thing that I want everybody to look at, I want everybody to see if you could Google or go to YouTube and listen to Roland Martin's takedown on Tubi Network. Everyone talks about how Tubi has all of the black content, it's great, but you never guess who actually owns it. The person that owns Tubi is the same person, Rupert Murdoch, that owns Fox News, that is pushing right wing right wing rhetoric and is also a mouthpiece for the Republican Army, Republican Committee. We have to get really we have to be really, really careful. We have to start leveraging our buying power. And if it means economic boycotts, as Dr. King had discussed, because let's be real, he was talking about that in the 60s. He died because he was putting together an economic boycott for the people, for the sanitation workers in Tennessee. We have to start leveraging our economic power so that we can show that we are an economic force, because it seems in this day, in this political day, the big game is the money game in politics. Protesting and everything is great, but think about what we can do collectively as a people if we can leverage our money and say, no, you're not going to build off the backs of black people anymore. You're not going to take our content. You're not going to put our children into economic slavery. We are now going to control what we do as a people. And I land right there.
Well, thank you, and those are definitely good reminders. And I kind of smiled to myself because one of the many speeches that I listened to yesterday of Dr. King, he ran down those same statistics and talking about, our economic power, and they used it very well. That was what the Montgomery bus boycott was all about, was leveraging that economic power. And again, I'm not sure how long you've been in the space, but I also talked about how, in his community, the community that he grew up with, even during the Depression, they
Right.
were able to maintain a sense of well-being, and they weren't shattered because they were spending within their community and helping to circulate that income, and
Mhm.
so the overall beloved community didn't fail because they were investing in each other and their community. So
That's right.
thank you for sharing those things. Like I said, I could just listen to him, his speeches, and his great insights and knowledge all day, and that's what I've just been soaking in, and tuning out a lot of this news. And I thank you for the tip
Thank you.
on the Tubi, because dark money is one of my pet subjects, and I always love exposing them so that people know, because these protests, which were going on this weekend and intended to be, you know, um, his day, being intended to be protested, is again has dark money behind it. Charlie
Mhm.
Kirk is supposedly, going to be doing his little smear campaign of Dr. King, which, like, 2 or 3 years ago, they were quoting him and talking about he's a good man and y'all need to be like Dr. King. When, as I said earlier, during his time, they did not like him. The FBI wiretapped him. They sent a letter to him hoping that he would kill himself, basically telling him, kill yourself before we release these tapes about all
Mhm.
of you. And he was in a state of depression about it. But he didn't kill himself because he understood what his purpose was. And that is where we have to be. Like, these times can seem very dark and difficult, but we have to understand our purpose. We are born into these times to do our part in these times. And this is where we are now. And it's going to require all of us. It will not be easy, but we have to use all of the tools in our toolbox, and those economic tools are definitely
Mhm.
some very substantial ones that have been used successfully before. I mean, this is how the Ku Klux Klan got destroyed,
That's right.
and that's what Tish James is doing in New York as well. So,
Right. That's
hit them
right.
where what's that saying? Hit them where it hurts in their pocketbooks.
Take
So,
the money. That's right.
exactly. So, I thank you so much. I'm going to go to um, the next speaker, which will be kind of the last one before I transition into kind of Project 2025 and some focus on what's going on here today and some of the dark money and the behavior of the radicalized cult that the Republican Party has become. So, Chima Riri, how are you doing today, my dear?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm getting through it. I'm getting through it. We have some deep, deep Alaska cold here in Chicago, so it's been quite challenging. And I have a cat that's been sick on and off, and trying to see those grandbabies too. I just want to thank you so much for this space, Miss D, Soul Sister, uh, my Queen Shantae, Queen of Receipts. It's so nice to see you here. LMZ, our attorney Mark, Geechee. And I know Khalil doesn't like when I say this, but we have given you that doctorate here. You are Dr. Khalil in Advocacy Arena to me. What you guys have shared is so powerful. And the Kathy, I really am glad you told me that because I had no idea that Murdoch owned Tubi. And that's very important to know because, again, we have to hit them in their pockets. I just wanted to share a small little story about growing up in Bellwood, Illinois. During that great white flight, I was born in 68. So when I went to school with Black children. I had Black neighbors, doctors, teachers. One of the teachers who I loved the most, he passed away a couple of years back. His name was Ronald C. Dunlap. He had played basketball, I think, for University of Illinois and may have been drafted by the Bulls. I don't quite remember. He was about 7'2". He was my science teacher for 2 years. And this man taught us about Martin Luther King. He taught us about the Black Panthers. And you got probably like 50% white, 50% black children because they were doing the busing back then. So they were busing kids from Stone Park, Melrose Park, which was predominantly white. We were busing back and forth. Sorry.
Are you still
Yes, I'm
there?
still here.
Oh,
This
okay.
man made a great impact on my life and many of my other friends who are my age with education, believing in yourself. He went to Appleton, Wisconsin. He became principal of Roosevelt Elementary School. While being principal there, he had the name of the school changed to Thurgood Marshall Elementary. He then went to Northern Wisconsin and took over there. And I think he was the first African American principal in northern Wisconsin. And in Appleton, they renamed the school after him. So I just wanted to share a bit of positive history that was part of my life growing up. And I am still blessed to this day to have had that man in my life because he made quite a difference for me. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that with you guys. Um, because again, I wouldn't know the things I know today if I did not have that black teacher. And I had many others, but we were in junior high and he talked to us like adults And he taught us many things that the government and other people were not telling us, especially about the Black Panthers. So thank you so much for this space, and I can't wait to keep listening because Project 2025 is real, and we've got to keep exposing this. So thank you all.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you sharing that heartfelt and heartwarming, experience that you had growing up. So it matters. It matters, and especially the fact that we are also experiencing a an assault on our education system, and how important history is. So it's really a great transition for me because I have I tweeted it on my timeline, but I put it up in the Jumbotron, and kind of the basis of where I'm transitioning here with the Project 2025 is also to kind of give us an overview of this movement. We know, and I've been talking about, the organization behind it, the Heritage Foundation, and how it is actually a building upon the mandate for leadership, which was given to President Reagan. And they just kind of dusted it off and updated it for 2025. And, they started working on this in 2022. But I listened to an interview with another historian because I'm a history geek, Heather Cox Richardson. If you haven't heard of her, go to YouTube and check out some of her interviews. She recently authored a book called Democracy Awakening. And this is an interview that I listened to her, which was done at the LBJ library. I can't remember the person that interviewed her, but it was another historian. And it's about an hour and 10 minutes or so, but worth your time because she really does a great job of kind of giving us a historical overview, starting back with the USSR, breaking up in 1991, and how then it was thought that, we were advancing democracy. But she says that unfortunately, we, being, the United States and other countries, conflated democracy with capitalism, and they're not the same thing. And when that happened, it allowed actually for us to start advancing this capitalism, masquerading kind of as democracy, and allowed our American oligarchy to start getting fomented, because what capitalism does is it puts property ahead of rights, whereas democracy puts social welfare above democracy. She also talks about after World War II, how we went into, we were in a period of enlightenment, and this is when, the liberal consensus was started. And the liberal consensus is just how people, having experienced the effects of World War II, the Great Depression, and these other things, that we started recognizing collectively as people that it was important for us to have certain things in our country in order for us to have strong, thriving democracies. And some of these things included, like social safety nets, and, government regulations and infrastructure and these types of things. And so this kind of brings me forward to the fact that she starts talking about, and I had heard it before, but not in the context in which she spoke about it. And we, as I said, have talked about Project 2025. That like the Leadership for Mandate was the precursor to this. Well, um, there's more, because there was something before the Leadership for Mandate, and it was called the Mandate for Leadership given to Reagan in the 1980s. And this was the Conservative Manifesto, which was penned in 1937. And when you listen to her and you recognize what it contains, it is very much the same things that are contained in Project 2025. It also speaks to and highlights how Dr. King talked about the white backlash that always comes with, advancements and improvements that include marginalized communities, largely Black, but other minorities as well. And so this was one of those moments of white backlash that occurred because they were calling for the attacks on the New Deal programs of FDR. And they wanted, we talked, MAGA, of course, is the party. They wanted to, make America great again and go back. And, sometimes people talk about, they want to go back to the 1950s. Well, they really kind of want to go back to the 1920s, because this was penned, the Conservative Manifesto was penned in 1937. And they wanted to go back. So this idea of making America great again or going back is not new. They wanted to go back to the 1920s. They wanted to get rid of the New Deal. And they called for an end to government regulation of businesses. They wanted to end social security and thought that welfare, should be done by churches. And lo and behold, we have this proliferation again of, Christian nationalism. And they also thought that infrastructure projects like TVA should be handled by private individuals so that, the money could go to private enterprises. They also were in favor of something at that time they called home rule. Today we would call it states' rights. And that was in an effort to get rid of pieces of the civil rights movement, which we hadn't even experienced or realized a lot of them at that time that it was penned, but they didn't even like the ones that were in existence at that time. And they didn't think that, the government should play a role in regulation, nor, that people needed social safety nets. And so, we see some of these same things. And what happened was, that this was, again, some of the white backlash that came about because some of the advancements toward equity and equality that were being made in the military, which kind of started with Truman because he integrated the military, and Dr. King talks about how in the military, Black men and women, they were considered, 100% citizens. They wanted them all in for that. But then when they came back to America, their home country, they were only considered, 50%, of a person. But she talks about how in this Enlightenment period, that when you made good arguments based in reality, you could convince people to agree and go along with these things, like the idea of a social safety net and how it's good for, everyone and those types of things. And what was happening, because remember, their goal was to undo the New Deal, and they were attacking it without much success because people were like, this is good, kind of sounds like the issue we're having with the ACA right now, right? But so the radicalized Republicans of that day, starring William F. Buckley, recognized that, he said, if we keep trying to get rid of the New Deal, and they keep voting for it. So he was like, we're going to have to change our strategy. He said, we're going to have to stop making, like reality based arguments and start basing our arguments in the premise of the nation should be Christian and to promote free enterprise, which is another form of states' rights, which means, because they said free enterprise, which means to get rid of business regulations. And, so he started writing and, giving speeches and penning, and it started taking root a little bit, but it really took root when he wrote a book in 1954 titled McCarthy and His Enemies. And so what they did, the narrative they painted was that McCarthy was a little rough around the edges, but he was right about socialism coming to the country to in the form of liberal consensus. And at that time, what she said was they made, because people were afraid of communism and these things, and what they did was they made liberal consensus an evil bad word, because at first it was just like a thing. It was just the concept of like where people were moving, thinking together. This is Democrats, Republicans, whomever, just reasonable, rational people. But they made it a thing like they are doing now, libs and these types of things. They capitalized it to make it appear, or equate it with communism. And then they continue to, sharpen their rhetoric, and this rhetoric, of course, all designed to push against the New Deal and to start, in a sense, brainwashing people and using religion as a big part of that. And William F. Buckley was, like one of the early co-founders of the Bircher Society. So this takes us into that dark money aspect, because who else was in those early days and co-founders of that was the Koch's fathers, Fred Koch. And he started the National Review, which was his, or at that time, it was their propaganda arm. So he started penning all these articles and things to continue to build their rhetoric and ingrain their propaganda and ideas into the mind of people. And the narrative that they painted around businesses and stuff was that he was telling them that it violated businessmen, that a government does all those things. It's redistributing wealth from the hardworking white people to undeserving African Americans. So this is where she talks about the weaponization of language. And this is what we have continuing today in a really extreme manner. And it brings me back to something else that's happening, this book banning. Like, they recently now have banned the dictionary and certain encyclopedias. Now, why would you ban, like apolitical things that are just, like facts based, just information? Because it helps push your narrative, and it allows you to actually change the meaning of words and to change the narrative without people having full understanding of it. So I'm going to stick a pause in it for now, because I have some people who are requesting to speak. Build Back Better, I know, can kind of add on to this. But I just wanted to make sure that people knew that, Project 2025's earliest iteration actually was in 1937 with the Conservative Manifesto. But the purpose and the agenda has not changed. They've just dusted it off and updated it to suit today's situation. So if you would like to kind of speak to that, I know that Build Back Better started requesting at that time. And when you get to Speaker Kim, you can, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, because I've always said if you really want to know what the Republican policy is to undo everything up into including the New Deal, and actually everything up into including antitrust laws under Teddy Roosevelt, who actually stood up to the corporatists in his party. I actually went back and researched. Basically, from the Civil War onward, the Republican Party controlled the government and the presidency at least, and large part of the Congress until 1920, actually 1930. It was there were Wilson and then Grover and then Cleveland who won non-consecutive seats, but the Republicans, even though they gave us the Civil War, they also oversaw the rise in corporatism of the tycoons and the robber barons and those guys, and allowing them to kind of gain control over the overall economy, giving them access to free land in the form. I mean, the biggest early tycoons were did train within the training or industry, the Cornelius Vanderbilts and those guys. But that was on public land, you know. Now it's kind of tech guys who make money off of public investment into what became the internet and all the technology that they use, but they don't want to pay taxes. They didn't have taxes until the Teddy Roosevelt era. But the New Deal, solidified what we were saying, or I guess Heather was saying, about it was really a shift of from what was called supply side economics to Keynesian or demand side economics. It was the acceptance and understanding that the growth of your country, especially when you start in the 20th century with, I'm not saying I love Henry Ford, but Henry Ford did start paying workers, which created a new prevailing wage, which made those workers, those what was once working class workers, a middle class, a growing emerging middle class. And it shifted the economy from just placating the wealthy for the most part to creating a middle class based on a working class that had disposable income. And since then, our economy, three-fourths of our economy is determined by consumer spending, which means the demand side is creating wealth. The supply siders in the Republican Party, though, resent that because by giving those workers disposable income to create more wealth and to grow the economy, it gave them also political power, and through unions, through the sheer size of their votes, and because of that, I mean, there was a reason why under FDR and LBJ they had such large majorities is because unions were supporting them. 1/3 of all workers in the 1950s were in unions. So that's not an inconsequential thing. And a lot of those were white male voters, white women voters, most of them white men, but and other people too. But they were voting lockstep with Democrats at that time, and that shifted with the change in what was called the Southern and also suburban strategy to peel away at least some of the white working class voters. But what you were saying about Buckley and Ayn Rand and a lot of other people who are referenced by a lot of the heritage foundation types now, they intellectualized greed, basically. They made it so that they can counter what we knew to be the case, which was those New Deal policies, not just in the United States, but those safety nets that were being created the world over, were indeed creating growth for workers, for countries, and plenty of people who were wealthy could continue to get wealthy. It wasn't at the cost of the wealthy. They could get wealthy, but it was organic growth. What was happening in the 20s that caused the depression under both Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, as it was manufactured. It was based on, there was a lot of in the stock market, for example, manipulation going on. It was lack of oversight. The tax cuts were creating artificial bubbles. There was manufactured wealth and manipulation of wealth too to steal people. There was like a lot of people there was no Social Security in the 20s, so a lot of people who were the nouveau riche or even middle class were starting to put money in the stock market, but then bigwigs stole it from them because they would manipulate stocks. We didn't have laws at that point to protect people because most of the time, up until the 20s, it was just the same wealthy guys sharing the same money over and over again. but it was the working class or the upperly mobile classes that were got screwed, and because of that, you had this Great Depression, and we had needed these policies, these New Deal policies, to bolster our economy, to save to save our country and to save the world, really, from what other parts of the world did go into authoritarianism because of it. But the Republicans have always resented that. They didn't learn from that laissez-faire failure. They don't think it was failure because the right people got wealthy. So ever since then, as you said, with McCarthy and onward, I always call them, every 20 years, Republicans get a pit bull. There's McCarthy, and their job is to muddy the word, whether it's socialism. 20 years later, it was Spiro Agnew, leftist. 20 years later, it was Newt Gingrich, liberals. 20 years later, it's Donald Trump, progressives, calling everyone Marxist, whatever the word is, woke, using the battle of ideas, of words, but not policy, to make their case. And it's not about anything other than demonizing the other side, making us assuming they're un-American, un-Christian, and that they don't belong, and they don't, their rights shouldn't be protected, and the policies that they vote for are anti-capitalist and therefore anti-American and anti-Christian. There's no country that's a pure capitalist nation. When they do have them, they fail. And every country, every OECD nation, every developed world country and developing world country has a mixed economy. And the trick is to find the balance between public investment and private investment. Even FDR maintained private banks. He bailed them out. He provided oversight. He highly regulated them, but he allowed them to remain private. He allowed a lot of industry to be private. A lot of the New Deal, the construction that was built on private contracts for public projects. He wasn't against that, but he also knew that workers needed protections too, because they are they are the source of growth in this country, especially in the 20th century onward, basically. So I'm interested to hear what she said, because I've talked a lot about these things. I've used different words to describe it. I know of William F. Buckley and his role amongst neocons and right wing supply siders, and again to intellectualize greed. But one of my favorite quotes from that era was I gotta have to find it real quick, but there was John Kenneth Galbraith, who was an economist, but he also worked in many different administrations at the time, and I gotta find it real quick, but and he was a Keynesian.
We lost you, Kim. Are you still there?
What's crazy is that you would think that she had already watched this.
Exactly.
I
And
mean,
it
seriously.
no,
When
and
she
I
talks
know
about the words and the language being
changed, and
changed
that's
and used and used against us, it's like I really wanted to be like, are you sure you didn't watch it already?
and that's the thing. Sometimes you know something, but it helps to hear someone who, has spent their life studying this, and, like most often it's academics, but not always, putting it in words that you can understand, and knitting together that story. And when I listened to this interview, like, I understood these things in principle, some just because of my knowledge, but it just rang so clear. So that's why I wanted to
Absolutely.
share it, and it really just connected a lot of dots for me. I think she was having some connection problems. I'm going to bring her back up to finish up a little bit, and then I also kind of want Mark, if he had more stories around SCOTUS, because there were a couple of things that I wanted to ask him about, and I'll find it, because there's, I know, we talked about the Colorado ballot bill going to them, but I think they picked up another. Um, case that they're going to hear that relates to abortion rights, if I'm not mistaken. And I just kind of wanted to pick his brain a little bit on some of those things. And then, like I said, kind of we're going to be ending here shortly. Kim, you're back up, so go ahead and continue. And if you could, just kind of try to,
I'm actually going to
get your
share that
thoughts.
because I found it in a meme, but I've also read books about him too. So, but it's a good reminder of what the overarching goal of the Republic of conservatism, and it's really when I say supply siders, what we should mean is neo feudalists. They want feudalism. They don't like. They want us to be peasants again. They hate that. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a very nihilistic kind of approach because they want to privatize everything. And I mean, can you imagine? Like the TVA was a huge advancement for people in Appalachia in this rural area, and they wanted to get rid of that. And the modern Republicans are pretty much the same way. It's different projects and things, but things that are actually good for people.
Well,
So
yeah,
when
the
people
rural areas were being neglected. The 20s were a great growth for cities like Chicago, New York, and Boston, and places where it was in the best vested interest of companies to have running water and telephones and electricity, but they did not. It wasn't advantageous to them for their bottom line to do so in Appalachia or in the prairie states.
Right. And can you imagine if these things were privatized? It would not be in their best
And so
interest.
those
So guess
people would,
what?
they never get it. They
Exactly.
never get it. This is
Exactly.
actually why we didn't have Wi-Fi in a lot of areas because of that.
Right. And so this is, again, I think it's interesting, but this is us connecting the dots that this manifesto was produced to fight against the New Deal and
And also,
Bidenomics.
I also like to
And
add, yeah, the antitrust laws too. Of
yes,
the,
and Bidenomics was yes, because that's always like there are three principles basically: no taxes, no regulations, and no unions. And it hasn't changed, no matter how they interpret it, rephrase it, or whatever. It is the same. It's the core of their principle, beliefs. And like they dusted it off and they pulled it out and dusted it off and updated it, and we have Bidenomics, which is again restoring some equity to the masses. The infrastructure bill, like we had infrastructure week every week when the former guy was in office, but nothing was built. But we actually have projects, being groundbreaking and being worked on, and broadband being expanded to rural areas, and all of these things. So again, this goes back to one of the speeches that Dr. King gave, why that like we can continue to expect that because this is what happens. There is always this white backlash whenever, equity is the truth of our constitution is being allowed to be experienced by all of the Americans in the country. So
so I'm going to read the meme because John Kenneth Galbraith was basically the big. He was like the counter intellectual because he was actually based on sound science and economics to people like Buckley. At the time that Buckley was writing what you were referring to, he said the modern conservative is engaged in one of the man's oldest exercise of moral philosophy. That is the search for superior moral justification for selfishness. And so people should really get to know not only John Kenneth Galbraith, but also people like John Maynard Keynes, who was British, who created what they now call the quote nanny state, but really just a modern safety net. And because they had an intellectual basis too. Conservatives, people like Steve Bannon, whenever I read Project 2025 and see how many times the word Marxist is viewed in it, I read it sounds like Steve Bannon. I think we should do a drinking game. Every time you see the word Marxist in Project 2025, you should take a shot. You'll be drunk by the 10th page because. But Steve Bannon does that too. He intellectualizes greed, and Kenneth Galbraith was one of the great economic supply Dan side Keynesian economists who argued in favor of what we now call Biden economics and FDR and all that. He was actually an advisor to FDR. So he's a good person to reach out to too in real time as those people were writing these counter arguments.
all right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And like I said, I wanted to, I wanted to encourage people to watch this interview. And she has many, but this one really particularly stood out to me and just resonated, and I felt like was worthy to be shared. And talked about, and it's based on, she's being interviewed based on the book that she wrote called Democracy Awakening, where she names the cause of our the danger that we face, and how they are weaponizing language to do it, and that in order for us um, to overcome and to get back to restoring the democracy that we have, which has never been perfect and never will be, but we can keep working on it. It's like we have to get back to fact based reality. And this, how again did they kind of move us away from that? One of his senior advisors, came out and just let us know, hey, we believe in alternative facts. This is just, again, them like trying to move people away from fact-based reality. And I talked about King calling for all of us to have a sense of unity and to come together. In order to do that, to have, discourse and conversations with people, you have to be dealing with facts and reality, which again explains why they are trying to remove history and these other things, so that we don't have the same language. We're not speaking the same language, and having the same understanding around things. So, again, just a reminder, a couple of things I put up in the nest on this chapter 2 of Project 2025 is, again, woke. You can play that drinking game, how many times you see that in there. But just a couple of things, of course, is it's all about, this part talks about the relationship between the president and the office of procurement and management, management and budget. And I highlighted, I screenshotted a couple of pages, and I highlighted that it was vital that, and this is like, I think the first, second page. Let me see here. Yeah, where they talk about the president today assumes office to find a sprawling federal bureaucracy that all too often is carrying out its own policy plan and preferences, or worse yet, the policy plans and preferences of a radical, supposedly woke faction of the country. Like, they hate people being woke and aware, basically being informed. And, they talked about the pervasive notion of expert independence. So they, again, anti-intellectualism, anti-science, and that protects so-called expert authorities from scrutiny, the presumed inability to hold career civil servants accountable for their performance. And this is, again, alluding to them wanting to push this Schedule F thing so that they can increase the number of presidential appointees. And another area that caught me is that they talk about the position of the director of office and budget management, that it's vital that the director and his political staff, not the careerists, so you're seeing that, not the civil servants that are already there, that are experts, drive these offices in pursuit of the president's actual priorities, and not let them set their own agenda based on the wishes of the sprawling good government management community. And then it goes on further to say the office should be engaged early and often in OMB's efforts to drive policy, including by obtaining transparency about entities that are awarded federal contracts and grants, by using government contracts to push back against woke policies in corporate America. So this is again, like a wordy attack, basically on DEI
DI.
and those types of things, like them, basically saying like we're not going to be giving equal access to grants and those types of things. So again, they just continue to tell us what their goal and their agenda is, and it is not for the majority of Americans, and certainly not folks that look like you and I. So, Ken, I'm going to give you an opportunity to chime in again, and I'm going to ask Mark if he'll give us some closing thoughts, and we're going to start to wrap up. And I want to invite you guys to our space later this evening, where we will be deep diving into the Iowa caucus and continuing with our remembrance and commemoration of MLK Day.
I just wanted to quickly point out, I picked up two memes. Well, one's not a meme, one's an actual article, but one is basically the reminder that 70% of the GDP in the country, Biden counties are the ones who provide 70% of all the GDP in the country. So those counties that voted for Biden are the wealthiest in the country. Red states are historically being funded by blue state tax dollars. So this argument, they try to make not just a political argument, but an economic argument. But the economic argument is that woke is profitable. There's money in it because our diversity is our strength. Our ability to find not only just appeal to a broadscape market, but also try to bring out the potential as many people as possible to add to the creativity of new ideas and new products and new ways of thinking and doing and living is actually profitable in the 21st century economy. And so for them to make the argument that woke is anti-American or anti-capitalist, no, it's not. It's actually very capitalist. It includes everybody as a member of the potential consumer market, but it wants people to do that with real wages and not debt.
Absolutely. Oh, and one of the things that I want to talk about and is that each of these things are penned by different people, each of these chapters. And this chapter 2 was actually penned by a guy, Russell Vought, and he joined the Office of Management and Budget when President Trump took office. He's also served as the deputy director and acting director prior to his confirmation in July 2020. He was responsible for overseeing the implementation of the president's policy, management, and regulatory agencies across the executive branch. And prior to serving in the Trump administration, he spent over 20 years working in Washington, D.C. with grassroots and public policy organizations. And before joining the administration, he worked 7 years as vice president of Heritage Action for America. And he worked on Capitol Hill, serving as the policy director for the House Republican Conference under then chairman Mike Pence, and as the executive director of the Republican Study Committee, and as a legislative assistant to U.S. Senator Phil Gramm. He is a graduate of Wheaton College and got his law degree from George Washington. And he is also founder of another dark money group, and it's called Heritage Action for America, most commonly known simply as Heritage Action. It's a conservative policy advocates organization founded in 2010. And it has affiliates throughout the state, and it's a sister organization of the conservative think tank Heritage Foundation. But he also founded two other, and notice how they use these 501c3 and 4 organization. And this was two pro-Trump organizations aiming to provide the ideological ammunition to sustain Trump's political movement after he left the White House. And it's called Center for American Restoration. And it is an advocacy arm of America Restoration Action. And so I just want people to understand that, these think tanks and the people who are involved in writing these policies have many, the tentacles are long and many, and we need to continue being aware of them and exposing them at every opportunity that we have and can get. So, Soul Sister, if you wanted to chime in, I see Ingrid. I'm going to give her an opportunity to say something. And then, Mark, if you are able and would like, give you an opportunity to close us out. So, Ingrid, how are you, my dear?
I am blessed. I am really blessed to be in this space today, Dee. You and Soul Sister and the folks that came up to speak. I'm telling you, it really, really meant a lot to me to hear this. And I just wanted to take a quick moment to say this. I am thankful to be in this country. And my mom, if she was here, she would say the same. She came here September of 1963, okay, where we were afraid for her, not realizing she was in New York and not in the South. Because even in Venezuela, we got to see the news of what was going on. So I just want you guys to know that, yes, I honor Dr. King and the legacy he left behind. And I just love the way that we're spending this day, his actual birthday, to celebrate him. I was always lucky his birthday weekend because my daughter was born on the 18th. So it's always been a weekend of celebration because of, the long weekend and her birthday on the 18th. So I broke water the day out, right after the long weekend, and there she was. But yes, I want to thank everybody here. You made us a lot smarter today. And it really, he must be smiling because, yes, he wasn't liked then, but he sure is appreciated now. And he did open the doors for people like me to be able, and my parents and my family to come here and be able to embark on that arc that he created for us. And yes, we have to continue to fight it because, yes, like Miss Jackson told me many years ago, my social studies teacher, the struggles continue. And God, I didn't understand it then, being a young girl in this country, but I definitely understand it now. And democracy is always on the ballot. So don't ever think that for 1 minute, once we win in November, because we're going to win, it doesn't stop there. We continue because the struggles continue. And thank you again for this space to be able to express this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you coming up to share that with us. And I'm glad that we were able to add some information. I hope other people got a lot to take away, and hopefully, got inspired because I'm inspired every day. That I host this space and hear from you guys and get a little smarter in my research to continue, my effort of informing and inspiring you guys to help make us stronger advocates for democracy and better civically engaged citizens. So Mark lost his connection, but I have him back there. I'm going to give him an opportunity for some closing words and thoughts. So you've got the floor, my dear Mark.
So and also, like, let me know what your Supreme Court question was. We got a couple cases that are coming up that I don't have too much confidence in because of how the preliminary ruling occurred. Like the Idaho law, they let it stand while they hear the case, so that doesn't look good as far as the 6-3 majority court. So
That was the
yeah,
one. That was the.
yeah, it
Mhm.
doesn't look good. It doesn't look good for that. I'm not sure what we're going to get out of that because the Supreme Court is going to have to start to narrow their decision with regard to what because there's no legislation, and the Supreme Court, this 6-3 court, is not going to make law, so they're not going to redo Roe. What they may say, so all we are in with regard to the Idaho law is over breadth, just basic constitutional principles, or vagueness as far as exceptions to the actual law. And so those are tough arguments, but that's why I said they're probably going to narrow the law to make sure that it allows for as much exception as possible. Meaning, they may have to even remand it back to the court for the state to identify with more specificity or generality what the exceptions are. So that's how the Supreme Court's going to approach this. They're not going to make any law from a federal level, but they will examine the law on well regarded and acceptable constitutional principles of over breadth and vagueness. And the more specific states get with regard to exceptions to reproductive health, the stickier their situation gets. So it's important for folks to keep um, keep the lawsuits going and keep jurisprudence going, so that if everything is essentially relegated to the states, then we need to make sure that we're refining the law to be the most benefit and the most beneficial to women's reproductive health and maternal well-being. And then, I've suggested this before. There's another go at it. Sometimes you have to take a step back and make legislation that has to do with just make maternal health the law. And if the Republicans come back and say, we can't mention abortion, maybe that's the case at this step, but making it the law makes it an issue and make privacy a part of the law without even mentioning abortion. It's a tricky situation, but there's plenty of people who are reproductive health specialists. I'm pretty much an expert on analysis, but I'm not. The reproductive health people probably know better than I do with regard to the specifics of DOD and what they can and cannot do. So I think there's a lot of activity that needs to. Probably happening, but if it's not happening, it needs to happen. I think there needs to be more lawsuits. As you can tell, there's been lawsuits on the right side with regard to reproductive health. There needs to be more on the left side. We have lawsuits coming up out of Texas and the Idaho case. But just to kind of wrap up real quick, this has been a great space, in this conversation regarding that's centered on Dr. King. We delved into the life and enduring legacy of, I think, one of America's most prominent figures. His tireless efforts and unwavering commitment to civil rights has left an indelible mark on not only our nation but ourselves. I'm smiling as I'm saying this because I just listened to the joy in everybody's voice today, and we explored a lot. It was almost like we were in class. Um, we explored a lot about his remarkable journey, but also acknowledged from some of our speakers the historical context of the civil rights movement, where some of us learned a lot that we didn't know already, that we didn't already know. Recognizing the countless individuals who worked behind the scenes tirelessly, like Bayard Rustin, like Geechee talked about, and the unsung heroes that helped Dr. King bring about the significant change that occurred in the 1960s that keep us that keep us having a voice today. But there's more than that. There's some powerful personal perspective that that was just introspective. I thought our dialogue extended to the profound that profound reflection on the bedrock of American society and how our personal journeys came from the heyday of Martin Luther King up till now, and how those inspirations sparked our curiosity and our insight and well, Dr. King's insight and wisdom, and everybody that participated in the civil rights movement, the kind of curiosity it sparked in us throughout our lives. Um, and it's how, it's why we have this third year of Advocacy Arena, where we celebrate, recognize, and aim to preserve concepts such as equality, justice, and liberty, that are not even lofty ideals. This is not pie in the sky stuff. These are fundamental values that underpin the very fabric of our democracy. And our conversation was just so meaningful, and it's meaningful in a way that we explored his life and legacy, of course. And it's through discussions like this that we honor the past, and we honor such figures as Martin Luther King on his day. And somebody pointed out that it's actually his birthday, and it's not always the case that his birthday is the day we celebrate. We officially, as a country, celebrate his birthday, which I think is significant because it's a very, very big year. God don't like ugly, and God don't lie. So
Exactly. I think it's a good sign for us
exactly,
that it this year it falls on his birthday.
yeah, absolutely. And so and again, the stories of individuals who navigated the challenges of inequality, discrimination, and adversity, like some of the people that came up and spoke and that are in the room today, are inspiring, and they go towards that idea. I always talk about this country as an entity in and of itself that is always in pursuit of a more perfect self, in its entity self. I'm not speaking of it as a deity. I'm speaking of it as a living document based a country that always wanted to be better and started off ugly. Speaking of God, don't like ugly. And if we are a nation that's based in Christianity, the more perfect union ideal is a part of that, and anything that's not a part of that, we cannot call based in any kind of religion that's based on ideals of equality, justice, and morality. And so, in closing, it's through discussions like this in Advocacy Arena that we honor our past, especially people like Dr. King. We gain insight, though, from that into our present, and we are able to chart a course for a not only a more inclusive, but a more just future for everybody. So, with that, thank you for an engaging and enlightening conversation today in Advocacy Arena. I'm glad that we took the joy of the day and celebrated as we all should, and stop and um, not dwelled on the drama, acknowledge it, but we kept the joy of the day going. So, great conversation today, everybody.
Well, thank you, and you helped to make it so. So I'm going to go to my fabulous co-host and give her an opportunity for some closing thoughts. Then I will close this out, and I have put the space that she and I will be co-hosting with Geechee in the nest, and this will be more political focus on the Iowa caucus, but also continuing to celebrate this awesome day.
I just wanted to say that I'm very grateful to have been here today. It was, as always, an informative space, and the participation from the people who were able to come up and share information and knowledge. I want to thank you, and hats off to you, applause to you. Geechee's no longer in the space, but I wanted to thank him for digging down into some more facts in regards to these hidden figures of our history of the civil rights movement, and how vital and important they are. And this is not in any way to take away from the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, um, who we all love in this space, who we all uphold and admire and respect, and who gave his life uh, and legacy to defend the rights of all people, especially those who were being underrepresented, and that is the Black community. Um, it was the workers, it was the women, it was a time of where bravery often meant putting your actual life on the line. And I don't think people of today really understand what that means. Like, when he stood up, and when others stood up, when they joined this movement, they did so understanding that they may not come out on the other side. They may not even be there to see the fruit of their labor. And all of it should be celebrated. All of it should be acknowledged. And it should humble us in a way that gives us pause when we even begin to take for granted the rights that we have today. And while many in this country have less than they did a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, there are still so many more rights and freedoms of our democracy left to protect and to uphold and make sure that we don't end up having the same conversation in another 2 years, in another 4 years. So I really appreciate all of the knowledge that was shared today, and I really appreciate everyone who took out the time to um, come in and celebrate today's occasion with us. Happy birthday to Dr. Martin Luther King, and God bless his family and his legacy. So I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here with you. And if I gave you a piece of information today that you found helpful or interesting or um, inspiring, then I'm grateful. And if I didn't, I'll try harder next week. Thank you so much.
Oh, you always do a fabulous job, and I appreciate everything that you brought to the conversation to inform and uplift us today. And I just want to say you gave me a perfect segue because with one of Dr. King's quote, in addition to the usual Representative John Lewis quote that I share. But before I share those two quotes, I just want to remind folks to listen to that Heather Cox Richardson interview. And like she reminds us that we can persevere to make our democracy better for more people and embrace a democracy that is inclusive and, with just two simple premises that we're all equal under the law, equal, and that we all have a right to a say in our government, and that we're all responsible for protecting everyone's right to those two things. And so, again, like I said, we are stronger together. And, I read some excerpts from his mountain top speech, and not only that one, but, in most of his speeches, he talked about the importance of unity. And there has never been a time more important than this because our democracy has never quite been so in danger as this, except for during the Civil War. That we understand the importance of that unity and that we put petty grievances and differences aside to come together around just those basic principles of democracy. Us all having an equal right to the law and a right to a say in our government. And with that, you talked about you know, um, character. And this is one of the quotes that Dr. Martin Luther King has from his Strength to Love, 1963. Um, it's He says, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." And we need to think about that. Okay. And then, of course, the words from the late great Representative John Lewis, which keep me hopeful. I hope they keep you hopeful. And that is, do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. So never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. And this time calls for all of us to be good troublemakers. And you all pretty much know how I feel about Representative John Lewis and how what a key role he played in the civil rights movement, and also the fact that yes, Dr. King is an icon. He's very special to us all, and they both have special places in my heart and in my love of history as well, and how that history touches personally for me in this state, because neither of them are from Tennessee. But John Lewis began his activism here in Tennessee as a college student, and that unfortunately Dr. King lost his life here in Tennessee, in Memphis, and he lost it to gun violence. We're still dealing with this thing today. Today. And I also want to remind people to, just pray for the city of Memphis, pray for our red state here, because this is also the month, like a week ago, another horrific death, almost like George Floyd, was Tyree Nichols, a very loving uh, spirit, and, these things are going to continue, but we need to continue our work to tap them down and get rid of them as much as we can. We can't legislate hate, but we can put protections in place so that people's personal racism and hate doesn't destroy us as a society or as individuals. So I just want to thank you all for joining Soul Sister and I today in this great space, at a great moment to celebrate the life, the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, the man, the movement, and the holiday. And I want to invite you all to a space that we will be co-hosting with Geechee tonight, which is about politics, the Iowa caucus, and a continuation of the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King. I put that space in the nest. It's also on my timeline. I'll retweet it, refresh it again, and that is occurring at 6 p.m. Central, my time, so 7 p.m. Eastern. So thank you all for coming and joining us again for a wonderful time of making noise and good trouble in advocacy arena. And I leave you all with peace and blessings, and I'll see you later this evening. Hopefully, you will join us.